The dog hit the floor before anyone moved. 110 pounds of military-trained Belgian Malinois, chest, heaving, legs folding sideways like something inside had simply quit. Monitors. Screamed. A trauma team scattered and Dr. Victor Hale, chief surgeon, 22 years of ego packed into a white coat, stood at the center of the bay pointing at a nurse. "Got her out," he said. Now the nurse he was pointing at was the only person in the room who knew exactly what was killing the dog. She'd seen it before in a ditch outside Kandahar, on her hands, and no equipment, and a handler screaming her name. She didn't move. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Megan Carter almost quit nursing started the same way most bad mornings did, with a fluorescent light buzzing overhead, and someone who outranked her making a decision she knew was wrong. She was 41 minutes into a 12-hour shift at North Star Regional Medical Center in Boise, Idaho, when she walked into Trauma Bay 2 and saw the patient file taped to the door. 63-year-old male. Action fall. Headed trauma. Elevated intracranial pressure. Unssured. Triage, except the attending physician had already ordered a sedation protocol. Megan had seen Phil twice in the last 8 months on similar presentations. She knocked on the open door frame anyway. Dr. Victor Hale looked up from the tablet he was scrolling through. He was tall, silver-haired, the kind of man who had photographs of himself shaking hands with hospital board members on his office wall. He ran North Star's trauma department the way some men ran countries, with the implicit understanding that opposition was a form of stupidity. "Order," he said, not looking up again. "The sedation order is already in." I saw that Megan stepped inside. She kept her voice flat. Blood pressure read. Came in at 162/94. "If we push midazolam before we bring that pressure down, we're going to spike his ICP. I'm aware of how midazolam works. I know you are." She paused, taking it anyway. Hale finally set the tablet down. Looked at her. The way people look at something they've stepped over before, not with anger exactly. Just the practiced boredom of a man who had never found it necessary to reconsider his own judgment. "You've been a nurse for what, 6 years, 8 years. He picked the tablet back up. "I've been practicing medicine for 23. The order stands. You're welcome to document your concern in the nursing notes if it makes you feel better." There were 3 other people in the bay: a resident named Paolo, a tech named Shauna, and a student whose name tag Megan hadn't caught yet. One of them looked at her. Not because they disagreed with her, she suspected. Because looking at her would mean choosing a side, and nobody in that room had the job security to afford it. Documented the concern. She wrote it clearly with timestamps and vitals cited. And 20 minutes later, when the patient's intracranial pressure spiked and they had to scramble for a second intervention, she stood at the bedside and ran the corrective protocol with her hands and her training, while Hale barked revised orders that sounded word for word like what she'd suggested the first time. The patient stabilized. Nobody mentioned it. Megan ate lunch in the break room with the door closed. She'd been at North Star for 2 years and 11 months. Before that, she'd worked a trauma center in Billings for 3 years. And before that, she'd spent 18 months doing contract work at a VA hospital in Spokane. And before that, before any of it, there was a decade of her life that she didn't talk about at work, didn't list completely on her resume, and had spent considerable effort making sure the people around her didn't think to ask about, because she was ashamed of it, because she'd learned early that military service, for a woman in a civilian medical setting, didn't work the way people assumed it would. It didn't earn you authority, it earned you questions. You were actually deployed in combat, and now you're a floor nurse? Like the math didn't add up. Something must have gone wrong. Something had gone wrong. Not the kind of wrong they were imagining. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister in Portland asking whether she was coming for Thanksgiving. Megan stared at it and didn't answer. She had 4 hours left on her shift, a dull ache behind her left eye that had been building since morning, and a second cup of coffee going cold beside her. She poured it down the sink and went back to the floor. The transfer came in at 4:47 p.m., flagged by the charge nurse as unusual. Military transport, not civilian ambulance. The patient wasn't human, or rather wasn't only human. The primary patient was a London retiree working dog named Ranger, being transported from the Mountain Home Air Force Base veterinary annex to North Star because the base veterinary facility had lost power during a maintenance failure, and the dog was in active physiological distress. A secondary patient was the dog's handler, a man named Sergeant First Class Dale Overton, 61, veteran tired. who had arrived alongside Ranger and was currently in the waiting area refusing to sit down. Megan heard about the transfer from Shauna, who heard about it from the desk coordinator, who had already passed the information to Dr. Hale, on the grounds that Hale had apparently decided that a military working dog warranted his direct oversight either because he genuinely cared or because there were 2 Air Force officers accompanying the transport. The optics of being seen with uniforms. She almost didn't go look, it wasn't her patient. She was already behind on her documentation from the morning case, and she had a patient in room 7 who needed a dressing change she'd been meaning to get to for the last 40 minutes. But something about the word canine sat wrong in her chest, like a hook catching fabric. She went to the supply room, grabbed what she needed for room 7, and took the long route, the one that went past the intake area. Ranger was on a wheeled transport stretcher, a military issue unit with straps and side rails. He was a Belgian Malinois, somewhere around 9 or 10 years old, based on the silver threading through his muzzle and the careful way he held his head. He'd been sedated for transport, but the sedation was wearing thin. She could see it in the way his eyes were tracking slow and confused, the way his breathing was doing something it shouldn't. She stopped at the doorway. The dog's abdomen was slightly distended, dramatically. Not the kind of thing that jumped out at you from across the room. But she'd seen that particular profile before, that subtle bloating on the left side. The way the respiratory pattern was shallow and rapid in a dog that should have been deeper into sedation. She was already running the math when Dr. Hale walked in from the other direction and clapped one of the Air Force officers on the shoulder, like they were at a fundraiser. "Lieutenant," he said, "let's get your dog settled. We'll run a full workup, get him comfortable, and have your base veterinary team updated within the hour." Officer, a woman compact, with the kind of stillness that came from having spent time in places where staying still kept you alive, shook Hale's hand without returning the warmth. "We just need to know he's stable," she said. "He crashed twice on the transport. Got him back both times, but his pressure has been inconsistent. Take excellent care of him." Hale was already gesturing to the team. "Otto, let's get vitals, Shauna. I need the veterinary consult," paged Dr. House. "Should be in the building." Megan stepped forward. Step. "But it was enough. His left side is distended," she said. "It's subtle, but it's there. I'd want to rule out splenic torsion before anything else. If that's what's happening, the sedation is masking how much pain he's in, and his pressure's going to drop hard when it wears off." Silence. Not the productive kind. The kind that has a specific texture to it. The particular quiet of a room where the person with the most authority has decided someone has overstepped. Hale turned and looked at her, not with anger. He wasn't angry. He was something worse than angry. He was patient. He said, "You're a floor nurse. This is a veterinary case under my oversight. I appreciate the input. Splenic torsion in working dogs presents differently than in." "I appreciate the input," he said again, with the careful emphasis of someone who had practiced making people feel small without raising his voice. But Dr. Rouse will be here in 10 minutes, and we'll proceed appropriately. Why don't you head back to your patients?" She didn't move immediately. She knew she should. She knew the calculation, knew exactly how many points she'd lose with HR if she pushed this, knew that the resident and the tech were watching, and that Hale would document this as insubordination if she gave him enough rope. She took one more look at Ranger. His eyes had found her. Groggy, still moving in and out of sedation, but his gaze had landed on her face and stayed there with a kind of focus that sedated dogs didn't usually manage. "Back. I'll document my observation," she said. "You do that," Hale said, already turning away. She was in room 7, changing the dressing on a post-surgical patient named Gerald, who had opinions about hospital food and wanted to share them when she heard the overhead page. Trauma Bay 1. All available trauma staff, not room 7, the floor she was on. But the cadence of that page, the specific clipped urgency that charge nurses used when they were trying not to broadcast panic over the intercom, pulled at something in her that didn't follow hospital protocol. Gerald was still talking about the mashed potatoes. "I'll be right back," she said, and didn't wait for him to finish. Ranger had crashed. She knew it before she pushed through the bay doors. She could hear the quality of the sound, multiple voices, not the organized call and response of a controlled procedure, but the layered, overlapping noise of people reacting to something that had moved faster than expected. The dog was seizing. Not full grand mal, more like the low-voltage tremor that came with severe high-tension limbs, twitching body, rigid eyes showing white at the edges. Pressure. Reading on the portable monitor was 61/34. Dr. Rouse. The on-call veterinarian had arrived and was standing at the foot of the stretcher, looking at his tablet with the expression of someone who had been handed a problem slightly outside his usual scope. Hale was giving orders in a controlled voice that Megan recognized as the voice he used when he was covering the fact that he didn't have a clear next step. Another bolus. His pressure won't hold a fluid bolus, Megan said from the doorway. She wasn't shouting. She didn't have to, not if it's the spleen. You push more volume into a torsion event. You're going to accelerate the necrosis. Look at his abdomen. She was already moving to the stretcher, already pulling on a glove. Right side's compensating, left side is rigid. You can feel it, you are not cleared to then you feel it, she said. She put her hand flat against Ranger's left side and looked directly at Dr. House. Not Hale. Tell me that doesn't feel like a torsion. House crossed the room in 4 steps. He pressed his hands to Ranger's side. For 3 seconds. That's tense, he said slowly. He needs emergency surgery right now, not in 10 minutes right now. If that spleen's torqued and the tissue's ischemic, every minute we spend doing anything else is tissue he's not getting back. Voice dropped to something that wasn't quite a whisper. Step back from the patient, is he right? The Air Force officer had appeared at the bay doors. Her voice was quiet and precise. Is this nurse right about what's happening to my dog? Nobody answered immediately. Dr. Rouse, Megan said, still looking at the veterinarian. You know what you felt, tell her. Rouse looked at Hale. At Rouse, something passed between them. The particular negotiation of 2 men deciding how much the truth was going to cost them. We need imaging, Rouse. Stat ultrasound. Oh. Thank you, Megan said. Hale turned to face her. His voice was quiet and completely controlled, and she could see in his eyes exactly how this was going to go once the immediate crisis was resolved. You're done in this bay, he said. I'm calling security. Tell them, she said. I'll wait in the hallway, but run the ultrasound first. She waited in the hallway for 11 minutes. She was not technically supposed to be in the corridor outside Trauma Bay 1. She had been escorted to the door by a security guard named Felix, who was doing his level best to look official about something he clearly found uncomfortable, and who had ultimately settled for standing 6 feet away from her with his arms crossed, rather than making her physically leave the floor. Through the bay window, she could see movement, could read the shape of it, the urgency that had a direction now, a specific target. Ultrasound machine was in there. She couldn't see the screen, but she could see Rouse's posture change, could see the moment he found what she'd told him he would find. The Air Force officer came out of the bay. She stood in the hallway and looked at Megan for a moment. They're prepping him for emergency surgery, she said. Torsion. They said his spleen had partially rotated, and there was ischemic damage starting. Megan nodded. She didn't say anything. You were right, the officer said. No, the officer looked at her differently after that. With the polite acknowledgement people gave nurses who'd done their jobs. With something more considered, she was trying to place a face. Where did you serve, she asked. Megan glanced at her. The way you assessed him, the way you read the presentation. The officer paused. That's not nursing school. I've seen a lot of people look at a down-working dog and panic. If you didn't panic, you ran a differential. I've seen dogs in distress before, Megan said carefully. Have I? The officer held out her hand. Captain Diane Voss. Military Working Dog Program. 366th Fighter Wing. Megan Carter Voss didn't let go right away. She was looking at something on Megan's chest, not her name tag, but lower the small shape beneath the fabric of her scrubs where Megan wore out of habit. She'd never quite broken a chain with a military dog tag. The tag had shifted when she'd leaned over the stretcher. The corner of it was visible above her collar. That's a military issue tag, Voss said. One, Megan said. She tucked it back under her collar. I should get back to my patients. She turned and walked down the hallway before Voss could ask the next question. Behind her, she heard the bay doors open again, heard Hale's voice giving instructions for transfer to the surgical suite, heard the rolling sound of the stretcher being moved. She didn't look back. The incident report landed on her charge nurse's desk before the end of her shift. She'd expected it. Doctor had filed a formal complaint, citing unauthorized presence in a restricted trauma bay, failure to follow direct orders from an attending physician, and interference with a medical procedure. He'd also noted, and this was the part that was meant to sting, that she had shown a pattern of insubordination over the preceding 18 months that warranted formal review. Andra Okafor, her charge nurse, called her into the small office behind the nursing station and closed the door. Andra was 54, had been at North Star for 17 years, and had the particular kind of exhaustion that came from spending decades being the person who stood between nurses and administration. It wasn't unkind. She just operated inside the structure. I've seen the report, Sandra said. You went back to that bay after being asked to leave, after the patient crashed, after being escorted out by security. Right. Yes, sat down, and the ultrasound confirmed splenic torsion. He's in surgery right now because I went back. Sandra pressed her fingers to her forehead. Again, I believe you. I think you probably saved that dog's life. But that's not the problem. What's the problem? The problem is that Dr. Hale has filed a formal complaint, which means it goes to review, which means I cannot protect you from whatever comes next. The review board is going to look at this, and they're going to see an unauthorized return to a restricted bay after a direct order from a senior physician. She paused. It's a suspendable offense. Megan was quiet for a moment. And if I hadn't gone back, Sandra didn't answer. Sandra. If I hadn't gone back, that dog was going to die in there. Lines. I know that Sandra's voice was careful, but I need you to understand what's coming. Okay, Megan said. I understand. She understood completely. She understood the way she'd understood a lot of things in her life clearly, without comfort, without the luxury of being surprised. Ranger came out of surgery at 9:22 p.m. She wasn't supposed to know that. She'd been pulled from the floor at 7, placed on administrative leave pending review, and told to go home. She'd driven to the parking structure, sat in her car for 8 minutes, and then gone back inside through the staff entrance. She knew didn't have a camera facing the door. She wasn't looking for a confrontation. She just needed to know he'd made it. She found Dr. Rouse in the corridor outside the surgical recovery area, stripping off his gloves. He stopped when he saw her. Whatever he'd been about to say died somewhere between his chest and his mouth. Rouse said, Sepline removed. We got there in time. Tissue was ischemic, but not necrotic. Another 20-30 minutes and it would have been a different conversation. Megan leaned against the wall. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Handler, she said. Sergeant Overton, is he still in the building? And he hasn't left the waiting room since they brought Ranger in. Rouse paused. No, she said. I just know. Rouse looked at her for a moment. For what it's worth, he said. You were right, and I should have backed you in that bay before Hale escalated it. You backed me when it mattered, she said. She pushed off the wall and started toward the staff exit. She'd gotten 3 steps when Rouse called after her. Fucker. She turned to Overton and asked about you, the handler. Asked who the nurse was. I told him your name. Odd. And walked out. The parking structure was cold. October. In Boise had gotten its teeth into the evenings early this year, and she hadn't brought a jacket. She'd been in scrubs all day. And now the night air cut through them like she wasn't wearing anything at all. She sat on the hood of her car and let herself be cold for a minute. Tag was out from under her collar. She didn't remember pulling it out. She was holding it in her palm, running her thumb along the edge, the way she'd done 1,000 times without thinking about it. The raised letters were worn smooth on the corners. The chain had been replaced twice, but the tag itself was original. Original meaning a decade and a half old, meaning the last time she'd been someone other than a floor nurse at a regional medical center in Idaho. She was not a sentimental person. She didn't make a habit of sitting in parking structures holding things that reminded her of the past. But tonight had been strange in a specific way, the kind of strange that reached back before you could stop it. Danger. She hadn't known that was the dog's name until she'd seen the transfer file. She'd seen the name and felt something go sideways in her chest, which was irrational. It was a common name for military working dogs. It didn't mean anything. There was no reason for it to mean anything. She put the tag back under her collar and got in her car. Phone buzzed, unknown number, 208 area code. She almost didn't answer. Megan Carter, she said. The voice on the other end was rough and measured, a man's voice, and it said 2 words before she recognized it. Corporal Carter. She went very still, not a request, not a question. The kind of greeting that came from someone who had known her before she was a nurse at a regional hospital in Boise, before she was anything she currently presented to the world. The kind of greeting that crossed the 12-year gap like it wasn't there. You need to listen to me, the voice said. Something's happening. Something bigger than tonight. And you need to hear it before tomorrow, because tomorrow is going to move fast. Her hand was tight around the phone outside. The parking structure was empty. Fluorescent light, 2 rows over, was doing the same thing. The one in the break room did, buzzing, stuttering, trying to hold on. Who is this, she said, though she already knew. Someone who knows what Ranger meant, the voice said. And someone who knows what you did tonight. All of it. A pause. Including that nobody in that hospital knows yet. Light in the parking structure flickered once and held seconds. Megan Carter sat in the dark with the phones to her ear and felt the ground shift under 12 years of carefully constructed ordinary life. She didn't hang up. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to a man named Walt Greer, and she hadn't heard it in 11 years. She knew it was him before he gave his name, knew it from the particular cadence, the way he put weight on certain syllables like he was choosing each one deliberately, the way he'd always talked when he was giving her information he considered important. Walt Greer had been a lot of things in his career: special operations liaison, military working dog program coordinator, the kind of man who showed up in places without being listed on any official manifest. Last time she'd spoken to him, they'd been standing on a tarmac in Bahrain, and she'd been shipping out for the last time, and he'd told her with the flat affect of someone who'd made peace with loss. The program she'd been embedded with was being quietly dissolved. "Walt," she said, "just that, yeah." A pause. "As I know." Eyes. "It's been a while. 11 years is more than I've been tracking you," he said. Not in a weird way. Keeping tabs. I knew you were at North Star. Knew you'd been there going on 3 years. Is that supposed to make me feel better? No, another pause, and she could hear him breathing, could hear what sounded like wind behind him, somewhere outside. "The dog you saved tonight, Ranger. I know who Ranger is, Walt." His voice changed. Not softer. Walt Greer didn't do soft. "But more careful you know of him. There's something you don't know. Something that's going to matter a lot, starting about 6 hours from now." She pressed her back against the driver's seat. The parking structure was completely empty now, the kind of quiet that had texture to it. "Tell me Ranger's handler, not Overton, was his handler for the last 2 years after reassignment. I'm talking about his original handler. The man he was paired with out of Lackland, Marcus Webb." She closed her eyes. She knew that name. She'd known it for 12 years and had spent considerable energy not thinking about it. Webb died 8 weeks ago, Walt said. Non-combat. Cardiac event. Off-duty, completely unexpected. He was 54. "I didn't know," she said. "You wouldn't have. It wasn't publicized." Walt stopped. "Before he died, he left a recorded statement, a formal military affidavit, and a sealed letter. All 3 were addressed to the Military Working Dog Program and to North Star Regional Medical Center." "Why North Star?" "Because Webb knew you were there," Walt said. "He'd been tracking you too, and he left instructions, specific instructions, about what should happen to Ranger if he ever died in service or shortly after retirement. He'd been sick for about a year before the cardiac event." Walt's voice went quiet for a moment. "He named you, Megan, by name, by location, by current employer. He said you were the only person he trusted to take care of his dog." The car felt suddenly very small. She put her free hand on the steering wheel and just held it. "Affidavit," Walt continued, "also contains a full account of your service record." Uncensored. He wrote it himself, everything from Fallujah to the Kandahar corridor. Everything you did with the K-9 units. Everything that got buried when the program was dissolved. His voice flattened out. "It's comprehensive, Megan, and it's going to become public record when the military liaison team delivers it to the hospital tomorrow morning. 6 hours. Maybe 7. There's a Navy SEAL commander named Thorne and a J officer named Delacroix coming to North Star at 0800. They were already en route before tonight happened." Just he paused, accelerated the timeline. She thought about the administrative leave notice sitting in Sandra Okafor's inbox. She thought about Hale's incident report. She thought about 11 years of keeping her head below the waterline at jobs that were a fraction of what she'd once been capable of. In a field that gave her enough proximity to medicine to feel useful, but not enough authority to be anything more than a problem someone else got to manage. "Walt," she said carefully, "what exactly is in that service record?" "Everything," he said, "including the parts that were classified." She was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that Walt said her name again, checking. "I'm here," she said. "I'm thinking. Don't think too long." "You've got a review board in the morning too, from what I understand." "How do you know about the review board?" "I know a lot of things." He wasn't being evasive. That was just Walt. He'd always operated from a position of having more information than he shared, not from secrecy exactly, but from the habit of a man who'd spent decades in spaces where information was the only currency that mattered. "Megan, whatever happens tomorrow, you didn't do anything wrong tonight." "You know that. That's not how the review board is going to see it." "No," he agreed. "It's not. But by the time Commander Thorne finishes his opening statement, the review board is going to have a different problem to worry about." "That's it. Get some sleep," Walt said, "if you can." She couldn't. She went home, changed out of her scrubs, and sat at her kitchen table until 2 in the morning with a cup of coffee she never touched and the dog tag in her hand. Her apartment was small and deliberate, not sparse because she was minimalist, but sparse because she'd never quite committed to the idea of staying anywhere long enough to fill a space up. There were books, a few framed photographs that were mostly landscapes, a corkboard in the kitchen, with a grocery list pinned to it that she hadn't updated in 3 weeks. On the table in front of her, her laptop was open to a search she'd started and not finished, Marcus Webb obituary. She'd typed it and then left the cursor sitting there without hitting enter for 40 minutes. Marcus Webb had been 26 years old when they'd met. Already on his second deployment, already the kind of soldier who made things look easier than they were. Ranger had been 4, then young for a combat dog, already exceptional, already with the particular intensity in his eyes that good working dogs had. 5, the kind of focus that wasn't aggressive but wasn't gentle either, just completely present. She'd spent 7 months embedded with Webb's unit as a combat medic. She'd pulled 2 soldiers out of a collapsed structure with Webb covering her from a rooftop she still saw sometimes when she couldn't sleep. She'd treated Ranger twice, once for a laceration after a search and clear that had gone sideways, once for shock exposure, after a detonation that had rattled the whole team's teeth and sent Ranger under a vehicle where he'd stayed for 6 hours before Webb coaxed him out. After Kandahar, she'd been transferred. The program had been dissolved. She'd filed paperwork, processed out, and spent the next 2 years trying to figure out what civilian life wanted from a woman who'd been a combat medic for a decade. Since nursing school had been practical, it had been useful. It had not been the same. She hit enter on the search. Marcus Webb's obituary was brief, 2 paragraphs in the Idaho Statesman, 1 photograph, a list of survivors that didn't include a spouse or children, his parents, a sister in Colorado, and a notation that he was a veteran of multiple overseas deployments, details withheld at family request. Megan read it twice and closed the laptop. She arrived at North Star at 7:45, 15 minutes before the military liaison team was scheduled. She wasn't technically supposed to be there. Administrative leave meant stay home, but the same gap in camera coverage that had let her back in the night before held this morning too, and she'd spent 11 years being careful about the route she took. She found Dale Overton in the surgical recovery waiting area, where he'd apparently spent the night. He was a broad man, going thin in the face the way some veterans went, like the body was burning from the inside out on reserves it kept finding. He had a paper coffee cup that had been empty long enough to leave a ring on the chair arm beside him, and he was awake, eyes up, the moment she came around the corner. He looked at her the way Voss had looked at her the night before. He was trying to place something, "You're Carter," he said. "Yes. You're the one who got it right," he said it, without inflation, without the gratitude performance that civilians sometimes did. Just a statement of fact. "How's he doing?" she asked. "Awful. They said he'll be awake in a few hours." Overton's hands were wrapped around the empty cup. "I've been with him 4 years. 2 years. As primary handler, 2 years post-retirement, just keeping him going. His hips are bad. He doesn't run like he used to." He paused. "He's still the best dog I've ever known." Megan sat down in the chair across from him. "Did you know Marcus Webb?" Overton looked at her steadily. "Webb trained me. He handed Ranger off personally when he retired the dog. 3 days with me before the transfer." He paused. "You knew Webb a long time ago. He talked about you," Overton said. "Not by name. He was careful about names. But he talked about a medic who'd been embedded with his unit. She was the best field assessment he'd ever seen on a human or a dog." He glanced at her. "I'm guessing that was you. Webb gave you Ranger's emergency protocols?" "He gave me a," Overton said, 2 inches thick, "every injury. Ranger had ever had, every medication he'd ever been on, every behavioral indicator that meant something was wrong. Said if Ranger ever went down, the first thing to look for was left side distension, because he'd had a minor splenic incident 5 years ago, and it was his weak point. He set the empty cup down. Binder was in the transport vehicle. I tried to tell the doctor, the tall one, the one who seems like he runs everything, and he told me the vet would handle it." Megan pressed her lips together. "He didn't read the binder." Overton's voice was even. He didn't. She heard voices down the corridor before she saw anyone, the specific cadence of military personnel in a civilian building, a kind of controlled precision that didn't modulate for the environment. She was on her feet before she registered the decision to stand. Thorne was exactly what the voice on the phone had described, without describing a Navy SEAL, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent years in situations where stillness was a survival tool, and who carried that stillness into every other space he occupied. He was broad-shouldered, dark-haired, going silver at the temples, and he was moving through North Star's corridor with a JAG officer at his left. A woman named Delacroix, based on the name compact and precise in her movements, and Captain Voss from the night before at his right. He saw Megan before she could step back. The recognition on his face was not the slow, uncertain recognition of someone trying to place a vaguely familiar face. It was immediate. Corporal Carter, he said. Not a question. The same 2 words Walt had given her on the phone, but different in Thorne's mouth, heavier, like they meant something beyond identification. Commander, she said. He crossed the distance between them in a few steps and extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and he looked at her the way people looked at someone they'd been told was dead. I was briefed that you were here, he said. I wasn't sure what I'd find. I'm on administrative leave, she said. Technically, I shouldn't be in the building. Understood. He glanced at Voss, who gave a small nod. We have a meeting with hospital administration at 8. You should be in that room. I don't think the administration will agree. The administration doesn't have a choice, Delacroix said. It wasn't aggressive. It was simply factual, the way JG officers stated things. Here, under military authority pursuant to an official inquiry, a hospital's cooperation is obligatory. She'd been in enough military briefings to understand how the room changed when authority walked through the door, but watching it happen in a hospital conference room was different. The North Star administrative team had assembled expecting a routine military liaison meeting about the K-9 Transportor Chief Operating Officer Brenda Farelli, a hospital attorney named Swick, and notably Dr. Victor Hale, who had apparently been invited or had invited himself, and who took the chair at the table's midpoint with the ease of a man who expected to be seated at the center of things. Megan was in the room because Thorne had requested her presence, and Delacroix had backed it with a phrase about parties with material interest in the inquiry that made Swick look at her twice. Hale looked at her once, and then looked away with the deliberate control of someone deciding not to show that her presence bothered him. Opened without preamble. He introduced himself, and Delacroix stated the nature of their visit as an official military inquiry into the care of a retired service animal and the professional conduct of the personnel involved, and placed a folder on the table that he didn't open yet. 8 weeks ago, he said, retired Master Sergeant Marcus Webb passed away. Prior to his death, Sergeant Webb provided the military working dog program with a formal affidavit, a sealed institutional letter, and a recorded statement, all pertaining to the care of MWD Ranger and to a specific individual currently employed at this hospital. He paused. That individual is Nurse Megan Carter, who I understand is currently under administrative review. Farrelly's expression shifted carefully. Commander, we have an active internal process. I'm aware of your internal process, Thorne said. I'm telling you that the military has its own process, and our process takes precedence in this specific matter. He opened the folder. Affidavit details Nurse Carter's service record as a combat medic, embedded with special operations units over a 9-year period. It includes documented accounts of 27 field medical interventions, 11 involving military working dogs, and 5 battlefield evacuations carried out under direct fire. The room was quiet. Her record was partially classified under a program dissolution order in 2000 and 2014, Thorne continued. That classification was not standard. It was administrative, tied to the program's decommissioning, and it was applied broadly rather than specifically. Sergeant Webb's affidavit provides first-person testimony that allows us to seek declassification of the relevant sections. He looked directly at Hale, sections, which include her training in veterinary combat medicine and her qualifications to assess and treat military working dogs. That voice, when it came, was measured and precise. Commander. With respect, Nurse Carter's military background has no bearing on her conduct here. Entered a restricted area after being removed by security. She gave unsolicited medical direction. She identified a splenic torsion that your team missed, Thorne said. It wasn't loud. He was quieter than Hale, actually. A dog, with a documented history of splenic vulnerability, which was detailed in the handler's emergency protocol binder, which was presented to you at intake and not reviewed. Put his hand on Hale's arm, a lawyer's reflex. We'll need to review those materials, Swick said carefully. You will receive copies, Delacroix said. She slid a second folder across the table. You'll also want to review the timeline we've constructed from the trauma bay's own monitoring logs, which show a 17-minute gap between the animal's first blood pressure drop and the initiation of your diagnostic protocol. During that window, Nurse Carter raised concerns that were documented in the nursing record and dismissed. Farrelly opened the folder. She read for 30 seconds and then closed it again. Her face had gone carefully neutral in the way of someone who had just understood the full scope of a problem. Take a recess, she said. Of course, Thorne said. The recess lasted 22 minutes. Megan stood in the hallway outside the conference room with a cup of water she'd gotten from the nurse's station and did not drink. Providence had come down from the waiting area when word spread hospitals being what they were. News moved faster than authorized communication by a significant margin, and he was standing at the far end of the corridor with his arms crossed and his eyes on the conference room door. Voss came out during the recess and stood beside Megan without speaking for a moment. Trying to argue the incident report, she said finally. His attorney is saying the internal review should proceed separately. It probably will, Megan said maybe. But Delacroix filed a request this morning to have the trauma-based security footage preserved and reviewed as part of the military inquiry. If they try to run a parallel process, they're running it under scrutiny, Voss paused. You know what's going to be on that footage, Hale calling security before Ranger crashed, Megan said. Voss said the sequence matters when he called security relative to when the animal's vitals began declining. She looked at Megan sideways. He called them while the dog was already in early decompensation. The footage is going to show that Megan absorbed that. She'd suspected as much from what she'd seen in the bay from the timing, but suspicion and documented footage were different things. She said Webb's letter. What does it say? Voss was quiet for a moment. I've only been told the broad strokes. It's addressed to the hospital, but the personal section is addressed to you. She paused. It'll be given to you directly, that's what Webb wanted. The conference room door opened. Swick leaned out and said they were ready to reconvene. Megan drank half the water, put the cup in the nearest trash, and walked back in. What happened next took 45 minutes and felt both longer and shorter than that. Farrelly had made calls during the recess. Megan could tell by the way she came back into the room, carrying more information than she'd left with. The hospital attorney had clearly reached someone in the board structure because there was a quality to the recess's aftermath that was different from its beginning. The administrative posture had shifted. Hale knew it too. She could see it in the set of his jaw. He was a man who had spent 2 decades reading rooms, and he was reading this one correctly. Thorne presented the formal components of the military inquiry. Delacroix outlined the documentation chain, and Farrelly accepted the materials with a formality that said the hospital understood its position. The administrative leave against Megan was suspended pending review. Not reversed, not yet, but suspended, which meant she was back in the building on official grounds for the duration of the inquiry. The meeting adjourned. People moved toward the door. He was buttoning his jacket, gesture of composure that was also, she recognized, a stall. He was deciding what to say. She could see the calculation, the man processing which response protected him best. Looked at her. This isn't over, he said quietly without drama. No, she said, an inquiry doesn't mean you were right. Ultrasound does. The footage will... His jaw moved. He left without another word, and she watched him go and felt nothing particularly satisfying about it. Because she knew better than most that people like Hale didn't concede ground until there was absolutely no ground left to stand on, and there was still plenty of ground. They brought her to Ranger at 10:43. He was in the veterinary recovery area, a section of North Star's lower floor that was used infrequently, mostly for service animal cases and the occasional large animal emergency. It was quieter than the rest of the hospital, the machinery less prominent, the light slightly warmer. Ranger was on a padded surface, his side shaved and sutured, a fluid line in his foreleg vitals displaying steadily on the monitor beside him. He was awake. That was the part she hadn't been prepared for, not his size or his age or the way the sutures looked, but the fact that when she walked through the door he was already awake and his head came up and his eyes found her immediately. Not because he'd been trained to track movement, because he'd been trained to know. Upton was standing against the far wall, giving her space. Voss was in the doorway. Megan crossed to Ranger slowly, keeping her movement visible, giving him time to process. She crouched beside the padded surface. Ranger watched her with dark, serious eyes. His ears were at half-mast, not threat posture, not submission. And something in between. Like he was waiting for information he hadn't gotten yet. She put her hand out, knuckles down, and let him take his time. He leaned forward and pressed his nose against her hand. Then he caught the scent. She felt the moment it hit him, felt it in the way his whole body changed, a tension that ran from his nose, through his spine, the small sound that came from him that was not a whine and not a bark, but something more interior than either. He pressed his nose harder against her hand, and then moved up to her wrist and then her sleeve, following something only he could find. The dog tag was under her collar. She pulled it out and let it hang. Life went absolutely still. He looked at it, then he looked at her face. His ears came fully forward. He made that sound again, the interior one, and then he put his head down on the edge of the padded surface and didn't take his eyes off her. Lofton's voice came from across the room, rough at the edges. "I've had him 4 years," he said, "and I've never seen him do that with a stranger." Megan didn't answer. She kept her hand on Ranger's silver head and let the quiet settle around them. She didn't know yet what Webb's letter said. She didn't know yet how the review board would move, or how the footage would read, or how many more walls Hale would throw up before the process ground him down. She didn't know if any of it would resolve the way it should, because she'd been alive long enough and in enough institutions to understand that right didn't guarantee resolution, and documentation didn't guarantee consequence. But she was in the building her leave was suspended, and there were 2 military officers down the hall who had driven through the night carrying a dead man's testimony. She scratched behind Ranger's ear in the spot that working dogs always had, the one that required no instruction. He pressed into her hand like he'd been waiting for it. Her phone buzzed. She pulled it out with her free hand and looked at the screen. A message from an internal hospital number she didn't recognize. Dr. Hale. A second complaint, expanded scope. He's added falsification allegations. He's claiming your nursing credentials are overstated, and your clinical decisions constituted unauthorized medical practice. She read it twice, then she put the phone back in her pocket and returned her hand to Ranger's head. Falsification allegations. Unauthorized practice. He wasn't backing down. He was escalating, throwing a wider net, trying to bury the inquiry's momentum under a different set of charges. It was the move of a man who understood that the best defense was a faster offense. And it was also the move of a man who didn't yet know that what Thorne and Delacroix were carrying in their folders went considerably further than a single incident in a trauma bay. Ross appeared in the doorway again. Her face was neutral, but her eyes weren't. "There's something you need to see," she said. "Commander Thorne's ready when you are." Megan gave Ranger one more moment. His eyes were half closed now, the sedation's remnants pulling at him, but he didn't fully let go. He stayed at the edge of sleep with his head angled toward her hand. "I'll be back," she said quietly. She stood up and followed Voss out of the room and down the corridor toward whatever Thorne was holding. And as she walked, she turned over the weight of Hale's new complaint and felt something settle in her that wasn't calm exactly, but was close enough to it to function. Because she had spent 11 years being careful, 11 years keeping her record tucked away, her history compressed, her competence visible only in the narrow lane that civilian nursing allowed. She'd done it deliberately, strategically, because she'd understood early that being too much in the wrong setting got you managed rather than used. But the record hadn't disappeared, the documentation hadn't disappeared. And a man named Marcus Webb, who'd watched her work in the worst conditions she'd ever faced, had made sure of it. Was standing outside the conference room. He had a sealed envelope in his hand. Her name was on the front in handwriting she recognized after 12 years without seeing it, the same block print. Marcus Webb had used on every piece of paper she'd ever seen him touch. He held it out, she took it, and down the corridor through a door she couldn't see from where she stood. A camera had spent the previous night recording everything that happened in Trauma Bay 1, including the precise timestamp of a phone call Victor Hale had made to security, and the precise timestamp later, 7 minutes later when Ranger's monitor had first alarmed. 11 minutes. Between the call and the crash. The hospital didn't know she knew about the camera gap yet. Hale certainly didn't know she knew, but Delacroix had mentioned preserved footage in the meeting, and Megan had been in enough operational debriefs to understand that you didn't preserve footage unless you'd already looked at it. She held the sealed envelope and did not open it yet. Whatever Webb had written was going to matter. The 7-minute gap on that footage was going to matter first, and when it became the centerpiece of an inquiry that a J officer was now formally overseeing, Victor Hale's second complaint was going to look like exactly what it was. A man throwing paper at a fire that was already burning through the floor beneath him. Athens. Thorne watched her hold the envelope and said nothing, because he was a man who understood the value of letting someone have their moment. Looked up at him. "You said Webb's affidavit covers Kandahar," she said. "Fallujah. And 3 other engagements that were classified under the dissolution order." His voice was level. "All of it. Everything you did. And if the hospital uses the falsification claim, we declassify on an accelerated schedule," he said. And the hospital's attorney gets to explain to a review board why they chose to take the word of an attending physician over a military affidavit signed by a master sergeant with an exemplary 22-year service record. She looked at the envelope again. Somewhere down the hall, Ranger was asleep with his head pointed in the direction she'd gone. And somewhere in this building, Victor Hale was filing paperwork that was about to collide with the full weight of what Marcus Webb had left behind. She slid her thumb under the envelope seal. The letter was 3 pages handwritten on standard notebook paper in Marcus Webb's block print, the kind of handwriting that didn't change whether the writer was calm or exhausted or somewhere between the two. She read it standing in the corridor outside the conference room. Thorne, giving her space and the sounds of the hospital carrying on behind her, like she wasn't standing in the middle of something that was quietly rearranging her understanding of the last 12 years. Webb had started with an apology, not the performative kind. Webb had never done anything performatively in the time she'd known him. It was a single sentence. I should have fought harder when they dissolved the program and took your record with it. Then he moved on because that was also Webb. He acknowledged things once and didn't circle back. Next page. And a half-covered Ranger, his medical history in meticulous detail, his behavioral patterns, the specific sounds he made when he was in pain versus when he was anxious, the way he positioned himself in a room when he felt threatened. Things that weren't in the binder he'd given Overton, things that lived in the specific language of a man who had shared years of his life with an animal and paid attention every day of them. The third page was shorter. If you're reading this, Ranger needs you. I know. You'll do what's right for him. You always did what was right, even when the institution made it as hard as possible. The enclosed documentation goes to the military program and to your hospital administration. I've made sure the record they buried isn't buried anymore. Use it however you need to. You earned it. He remembers you. I want you to know that dogs don't carry the past the way we do. They carry it better. He's been waiting for something he couldn't name. I think it was you. Take care of my dog, Carter Webb. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her scrub pocket. Thorne was watching her from 6 feet away, with the disciplined patience of a man who had delivered difficult things to people before, and understood that the appropriate response was to let them land. There's more, he said in the documentation packet. You don't need to see all of it today. What's the most urgent piece, she asked. Footage. Delacroix had set up in the small conference room adjacent to the main one, and when Megan and Thorne came in, she had a laptop open and a timestamp log printed and spread across the table. She didn't offer pleasantries. Delacroix operated at a consistent temperature of focused efficiency. And right now that efficiency was aimed at a 17-minute sequence of trauma-based security footage that she had already watched 4 times before the meeting started. I'm going to walk you through the sequence, Delacroix said. She turned the laptop to face them. The footage was grayscale, high angle, covering the trauma bay from the northwest corner. Cross-referenced the monitor logs, the nursing record, and the security dispatch log. She pressed play. The footage moved in real time. Megan watched herself enter the trauma bay. The first time she hadn't realized how clearly the camera covered the full room, hadn't thought about what it would look like from above. She watched the exchange with Hale. She'd remembered it as fast, but watching it from outside, it was slower, more deliberate on Hale's end. He'd looked at her, processed her, and made a decision. She could see it now in a way she couldn't from inside the moment. Before, Delacroix said. That's when you first raised the concern about left side distension. Hale dismisses it. You document, you leave. She hit pause. Watch the monitor in the upper left of the frame. Megan looked. The monitor reading was visible blurry at this resolution, but Delacroix had the log. Pressure. 78 dropping 1418, Delacroix said. 18 minutes. After your first observation, Ranger's systolic has fallen to 78. This is documented in the monitoring log, but there's no corresponding physician response visible in the footage. She advanced the frame. 22. Hale steps out of the bay. He's outside for 6 minutes. During those 6 minutes, the animal's pressure drops to 64. Out. Megan said yes with an unstable patient. An unstable patient. Delacroix's voice was even. The security dispatch log shows he called for security at 14:23. Minute. After he stepped out 4 minutes before he came back in. The room was quiet. He called security while he was in the hallway, Thorne said, while Ranger was crashing inside. The dispatch log timestamp is unambiguous, Delacroix said. He didn't call security because you'd returned. He called security before he came back in, before anyone had reported your return. She looked at Megan. You came back at 14:29. Security was already dispatched at 14:23. Life. He called them preemptively. He was removing you from the building before the animal's condition became undeniable. Megan sat back. She'd known in the loose way of someone who'd processed a situation under pressure that the timing was wrong. Knowing it and seeing it on a time-stamped log were different weights on the same scale. That's gross negligence, she said at minimum, Delacroix said. The falsification question, the new complaint he filed this morning, is going to complicate this because it's designed to redirect the inquiry. Scott's attorney filed it at 9:17. The complaint alleges credential misrepresentation and scope of practice violation. She paused, without tactical logic. If the inquiry has to spend resources responding to allegations against you, it takes pressure off him. I make it stick, Thorne asked. The scope of practice allegation is weak. She raised a clinical concern and documented it. She didn't perform a procedure without authorization. The credential claim is weaker still, but it's going to require us to move on declassification faster than I'd planned. Delacroix closed the footage window. I'm filing for emergency declassification this afternoon. Given Webb's affidavit and the active inquiry, I expect it to be granted within 72 hours. And in the meantime, Megan asked, in the meantime, Hale is still on staff. His complaint is active, and the hospital administration is in a position where they have competing pressures. They want to manage the liability from the footage, but they also don't want to move against a 23-year chief surgeon preemptively. Delacroix looked at her steadily. Which means the next 72 hours are going to be uncomfortable. I've been uncomfortable before, Megan said. She spent the next 4 hours doing the thing she was best at, which was working. Her administrative leave was suspended, which meant she was technically back on floor status pending the inquiry's progress. And Sandra Okafor, who had heard enough of the morning's proceedings through the hospital's efficient informal communication network to understand the shape of things, assigned her to the lower floor rather than trauma, which was Sandra's way of keeping her out of Hale's immediate orbit without making it look like a protective measure. She checked on Ranger at noon. He was more alert, sitting up on the padded surface, tracking movement in the room with the focused attention of a dog who had decided that consciousness was worth the effort. Vitals were stable, his fluid line running smoothly, the suture site clean and holding. Athens Overton was there. He'd brought food from the cafeteria and was eating a sandwich with the mechanical commitment of someone who'd been awake for 30 hours and was fueling rather than eating. He keeps looking at the door, Overton said. He's orienting. She checked the fluid line, checked the monitor. He doesn't fully understand where he is. That's normal post-anesthesia. He looked at the door. The whole time you were gone, Overton took another bite, chewed. That's not orienting. She didn't answer that. She updated the monitoring chart, noted the improvements, and spent a few minutes with her hand on Ranger's back, feeling the steady movement of his breathing. His ribs expanded and contracted with none of the shallow rapidity from the night before. He was working less hard. Delacroix is filing for declassification this afternoon, she told Overton, because he deserved to know the shape of what was happening. Webb would have wanted this, Overton said. He spent I don't know how many years being angry about what happened to your record. He mentioned it the last time I saw him 2 months before he died. He crumpled the sandwich wrapper. He said, and I'm giving you his exact words here, that the Army had done a hell of a job making sure nobody knew what you could do, and that it was going to catch up with them eventually. It caught up with him first. She said, yeah. Overton's voice went quiet. It did. She left the recovery room and went back to the floor, and for the next 2 hours she was a nurse, vital checks, dressing changes, a patient in room 14 who was anxious about a procedure scheduled for the following morning and needed 15 minutes of someone sitting with them and answering questions with clarity instead of reassurance language. She gave that. She was good at it, better maybe than she gave herself credit for, because she'd learned years ago that the most useful thing you could do for someone who was scared was give them accurate information and let them decide how to feel about it. At 2:17, Sandra appeared at her elbow. Hale's called a department meeting, Sandra said quietly. Staff. Only 3 o'clock, she paused. You're not invited. But I think you should know it's happening. What's the stated purpose? Off update. Which means it's not a staff update. Sandra looked at her carefully. He's still got support in that department, Megan. Not everyone who watched what happened yesterday is going to testify to what they saw. No, Paolo filed a corroborating account this morning. Didn't Megan absorb that? She'd expected Shauna's silence, not because Shauna was dishonest, but because Shauna had 3 kids and a mortgage and a job she couldn't afford to lose, and testifying against a chief surgeon was a different calculation when those were the stakes. That's her choice to make, Megan said. I know, I'm just telling you the count. What's the count? Counting Paulo. You have 2 corroborating accounts from inside the bay. Footage. The monitoring logs, the military documentation. Sandra paused. Right. He has his incident report, his second complaint, and whatever he's building in that 3 o'clock meeting. Fine. Then I need Delacroix to move fast. I think you need more than that, Sandra looked at her levelly. 5. I think you need the hospital board to understand what's on that footage before Hale gets to frame it for them. 5. Because right now the COO is trying to manage 2 competing stories, and whichever one lands with the board first is going to define the shape of the next 2 weeks. 8. She found Thorne in the hospital's small family lounge at the end of the administrative wing, which was the closest thing to a private space he'd been able to claim in a building he didn't know. He was on the phone, standing with his back to the door, and he held up one finger when she entered. Give me a minute. She sat and waited. He finished the call, turned around, and read her face. What happened? Hale's running a parallel narrative inside his department. He's got enough influence to shape what his staff says on the record. She leaned forward. If we wait 72 hours for declassification, he's going to use that time. He's going to have the board briefed on his version before our documentation is cleared to be presented. Sat down across from her. What are you suggesting? Affidavit is already written. The footage is already preserved. Our monitoring logs are already in Delacroix's hands. She paused. None of those things require declassification. The affidavit covers Webb's first-person testimony that doesn't need clearance. It's personal testimony. The footage is hospital property. The logs are hospital records. You want us to move on the board directly, Thorne said. 5. I want you to request an emergency board briefing based on what you already have without waiting for the classified sections. She met his eyes. Classified sections strengthen the case. They're not the case. He was quiet for a moment. Not because he disagreed, she could see that he didn't disagree, but because he was a methodical man, and he was running the steps. 5. If I request an emergency board briefing and the declassification comes through after, he said slowly, anything the board heard in the interim briefing has to be reconciled with the classified record. There's also a risk that moving too fast looks reactive. It looks like we're trying to beat him to the room rather than present a complete case. We are trying to beat him to the room, she said. Because if we don't, there isn't a complete case to present. There's a contested narrative. Looked at her for a long moment. She held it. She'd learned in the military that the quality of your argument didn't always matter as much as your willingness to stand behind it, and she was standing. Let me call Delacroix, he said. The board briefing request went in at 3:45. At 4:30, the hospital's board chair, a woman named Miriam Stokes, who had a background in healthcare administration, and the particular quality of stillness that came from having heard a lot of very bad news in professional settings, had agreed to an emergency session at 6 p.m. Hale's 3 o'clock meeting had ended at 3:50. Whatever he'd said in it, the effect was visible in the trauma department's energy. By the time Megan did her 4 o'clock round through the lower floor, a specific kind of charged, quiet people being careful with their expressions. Found her at 4:15 near the supply room. He was 28, a second-year resident, and he looked like he hadn't slept well since the previous day. He had the specific appearance of someone who had made a decision and was not entirely comfortable with it, but was not going back on it. I gave Delacroix a full written account this morning, he said. Everything I saw, including the monitoring logs I was tracking. I had the numbers, I was watching the pressure drop, and Hale told me to hold the fluid protocol and wait for Dr. House. He stopped. I held it. I shouldn't have held it. You were following your attending's order, she said. I was following an order that was going to kill a patient. His jaw tightened. It's a dog, I know, that changes the legal scope, but it doesn't change what I was watching happen. I should have pushed harder. You backed me when I came back in, she said. 3 minutes too late, she looked at him steadily. 3 minutes is not too late. 3 minutes is why he's alive. She paused. Account you gave Delacroix, was it accurate? On to the time stamps. Then you did your job both times. She held his gaze until she was sure he'd received it, and then she went back to her patients. The 6 o'clock board briefing was not something she was invited to. She knew it was happening. Thorne had told her the time, and Delacroix had confirmed that she and Thorne would present directly to the board, but Megan's role in that room was as subject, not presenter. She was the case, not the attorney. She used the hour to sit with Ranger. He was eating not much, a small amount of the recovery diet Rouse had ordered, taken carefully, with the deliberate approach of an animal who'd learned to be cautious about what his body was doing. He was eating, which was the first real marker that he was choosing to recover rather than simply enduring it. She sat on the floor beside his padded surface. It was not a comfortable position. The floor was hard and she'd been on her feet for most of the day, but she didn't particularly care. Danger had shifted his position when she sat down, moved so that his back was closer to her knee, and she put her hand on his back, and they stayed like that for a while. There was a quality to being with a working dog that she'd never found an adequate civilian equivalent for life. They were not pets in the way that word usually meant. They were colleagues, more or less. Animals who had chosen a kind of partnership that required them to function in conditions that most animals would find unbearable. The ones she'd worked with overseas had carried that in their bearing a specific weight to them, a gravity. Danger had it. Even now, recovering sutured, working through the confusion of anesthesia and unfamiliar surroundings, he had that quality of a dog who had done serious things and knew it. Webb had understood. That Webb had understood it better than almost anyone. She was thinking about the letter bout. He's been waiting for something he couldn't name when her phone buzzed. Stokes is running it tight. Hale's present. She stared at the message. Hale was in the room. He'd been invited as the subject of inquiry, presumably, or perhaps he'd insisted, or perhaps the board had decided that the appearance of fairness required him to hear the presentation, whatever the reason he was in there. She put the phone face down on the floor and kept her hand on Ranger's back. 20 minutes passed. Then 30 Ranger finished the small amount of food and settled his head near her knee and dozed in the light, intermittent way of an animal who was healing and hadn't fully decided whether to trust the quiet. At 7:14, her phone buzzed again, not Thorne. An internal hospital number. Sandra's extension, she answered. You need to come to the administrative wing, Sandra said. Her voice was level. But Megan had worked with Sandra Okafor for 3 years, and she knew the exact texture of Sandra's controlled delivery. Wow. Not in 5 minutes. What happened? The board session is still running. I walked out 20 minutes in and went directly to the records office. Sandra paused. He's pulling charts, yours and 3 others. He told the records clerk he had COO authorization. DeFairley is in the board session. She didn't give him authorization a beat. Records. The clerk didn't know that Megan was already moving. Which charts? Paulo Reyes-Dale Overton's intake documentation. Sandra's voice dropped half a register. In Ranger's surgical record. She was through the recovery room door and into the corridor before Sandra finished the sentence. Ranger's surgical record. The documentation that showed the exact timeline of his deterioration. The exact point at which the splenic torsion had been identified, the exact sequence of interventions. Record. That combined with the monitoring logs painted the clearest possible picture of what Hale had allowed to happen. Records office was 2 floors up and at the opposite end of the building. She hit the stairwell at a pace she hadn't used in a civilian setting and was on the 2nd floor in 40 seconds. Records office had a half-glass door. Through it, she could see the clerk, young, visibly uncomfortable, standing at a filing terminal with a folder in front of her, and Hale at the counter with his white coat and his particular quality of absolute certainty. And he was talking to her in the smooth, unhurried tone of a man who expected compliance and was currently receiving it. Megan pushed through the door. Hale looked up. His expression didn't change exactly. It was more that it resolved. He'd been waiting for this. Like her appearance confirmed something he'd already decided. He said. You're not authorized. She doesn't have CO authorization, Megan said to the clerk. Can you confirm whether you received written or verbal authorization from CO Fairley before pulling those charts? The clerk looked between them. She was 23, maybe 24, and she was doing the calculation of 2 authorities in direct conflict in real time. He told me he had verbal authorizations. Awfully. Is in a board session right now, Megan said. She's been in that session for the last 40 minutes. The clerk's face shifted. He said, it was urgent, Hale said, still in the smooth tone. And it is authorized, Carter. I'm asking you to leave this office. You're pulling charts that are evidence in an active military inquiry, Megan said. She was not shouting. She was using the voice learned in field situations where panic was a luxury. Nobody could afford flat, direct, entirely certain. That's an interference with the federal process. That's not a hospital disciplinary issue, Dr. Hale. That's a federal issue. The clerk put the folder down. It was a small gesture. Both of them saw it. Hale looked at the folder on the counter for 1 second. Then he looked at Megan. Something moved through his expression that was not exactly fear. Victor Hale was not the kind of man who did fear simply openly, but it was adjacent. It was the look of a man who had made a calculation that had just stopped adding up. You have no authority here, he said. Neither do you, she said. Not in this room. Not on these charts. Not without written authorization that doesn't exist. He straightened. He adjusted his coat. He did all the things a man did when he was deciding how to exit a situation with the least visible loss. This isn't over, he said, the same words as before. Dr. Hale, she said, I think you should go back to that board session. Left. She stood in the records office until she heard his footsteps move away down the corridor, and then she turned to the clerk, whose hands were shaking slightly on the folder. Don't release those charts to anyone without written CSO authorization and a copy to Commander Thorne, Megan said. You can call the administrative wing directly to confirm that request, she paused. You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't know. The clerk nodded, not quite trusting her voice. Ian. Megan pulled out her phone and texted Thorne. Hale just tried to pull charts from records. Surgical record, monitoring documentation, Otto's file, Bufferton's intake, back in the building watch for him. The response came in 40 seconds. Understood. Has the footage. Stokes is not happy. She read that twice and put the phone in her pocket. Stokes is not happy, which meant the footage had landed. Which meant the 7-minute gap between Hale's security call and Ranger's first crash alarm was now visible to the board chair of North Star Regional Medical Center and Miriam Stokes, who had spent 2 decades in healthcare administration and had the stillness of someone who had absorbed a lot of bad news professionally, was sitting in a room with that footage, and whatever expression a woman like her made when she understood the full scope of what she was looking at. Megan went back to the stairwell. She was 2 steps down when her phone rang. Not a text, a call. Walt Greer's number, Walt, she answered. I need you to listen carefully, he said. Something's happened. An hour ago, the Mountain Home Base commander contacted our program office. We don't know who yet filed an anonymous tip to the Idaho Medical Board, alleging that Nurse Megan Carter performed unauthorized surgical consultation on a veterinary patient without appropriate licensure. His voice was controlled but quick. It went in at 5:42, 20 minutes before your board session started. She stopped on the stairs. The medical board received it, she said. See it and logged it, which means there's now a parallel licensing complaint against you running concurrent with the hospital inquiry and the military declassification process. He paused. Anonymous. Tips to the medical board trigger a mandatory preliminary review. They have to respond optional. She sat down on the stair. The concrete was cold through her scrubs. He filed it, she said. Before the board session, he knew the footage was coming. I can't confirm who filed it, Walt said. But the timing is not a coincidence, she said. No, Walt agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Megan, I need to tell you something else. Something I should have told you last night, she waited. Classified sections of your record, the parts that cover Kandahar, the canine medical work, the field interventions. They don't just establish your qualifications. Some of what's in there is going to draw attention. Not negative attention, but the kind of attention that comes when something that was kept quiet stops. Being quiet. He stopped. There are people in this process on the military side who have reasons to want your full record declassified that go beyond this inquiry. People who've been waiting for a legitimate trigger. People. A congressional oversight committee, Walt said, that's been investigating the dissolution of the embedded medic programs. 3 programs closed between 2012 and 2015. Yours was one of them. The committee has been building a case that the dissolutions were premature and that the personnel involved were inadequately compensated, inadequately documented, and in some cases actively harmed by the classification of their records. He paused. Your case specifically has been on their list for 18 months. Ebb's affidavit just gave them the lever they needed. The stairwell was very quiet. She could hear her own breathing. Halt, she said. How big does this get? He took a long time to answer. Bigger than a hospital, he said. If the committee decides to move on this, and the declassification goes through, and the medical board complaint triggers a licensure defense, Megan, you're going to need more than Thorne and Delacroix. He stopped. She heard something on his end, a voice, someone saying his name. A pause. Then Walt came back and his voice had changed. On the news. He said, local right now. What? Just turn it on. His voice was clipped in the way it got when he was processing something fast. I'll call you back in 10 minutes. The call ended. She sat on the cold concrete stair with the phone in her hand, and after 3 seconds she pulled up the local Boise news feed on her phone browser, and it took the page 11 seconds to load. And when it loaded, the headline at the top was not about the hospital, and not about the military inquiry, and not about Ranger or Hale or any of the things she'd spent the last 24 hours inside. It was about a video 47 seconds of security footage, posted anonymously to a local news tip line at 6:58 p.m., showing a hospital corridor, showing a man in a white coat, showing the unmistakable interior of North Star Regional Medical Center's records office, and the footage shot from an angle she hadn't noticed, captured everything, including Dr. Victor Hale standing at the records counter and the clerk handing him a folder, mine included. Because the camera covered the full room was the door and the timestamp on the door's security panel and the notation in the corner of the frame of an access code entered by Hale that was not his own. He hadn't used verbal authorization, he'd used someone else's access code. Phone buzzed Thorne. "Where are you?" She typed back, "Stairwell, second floor." "Hi." 3 minutes later, the stairwell door opened, and Thorne came through it with the particular energy of a man moving towards something rather than away from it. And behind him was Delacroix, and behind Delacroix was Sandra Okafor. And all three of them had the same expression, which was the expression of people who had just watched something they'd been building carefully for 12 hours. Accelerate past the point where careful was the operative word. "It's the footage," Thorne said. "I saw it," she said. "The board chair is calling an emergency session. Tonight he looked at her. Has been asked not to leave the building. He used someone else's access code," she said. We know Delacroix's voice was precise and absolutely without triumph, because Delacroix operated that way, belongs to Dr. Anita Ferris. She's a pathologist, she's been on vacation since Monday, and she has no record of providing her code to anyone. She paused. That's unauthorized access to protected medical records. That moves this from a disciplinary matter to a potential criminal referral. Megan stood up from the stair. Her legs were steadier than she expected. "What do you need from me?" she asked, a written account of the records office confrontation. Delacroix said, "I'm stamped. Your words, your observations. I need it before the emergency session starts." "When does it start?" 8:30, Sandra said. 40 minutes. "I'll have it in 20, Megan said. She pushed the stairwell door open and walked into the corridor, and she was already composing the first sentence in her head the way she'd been trained to compose field reports. Clean and sequential, and stripped of everything that wasn't observable fact, when her phone buzzed one more time. Unknown number. "Different from last night's," she answered. "April Carter." A woman's voice, firm, unhurried. "My name is Representative Carolyn Marsh. I chair the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Personnel. I'm calling from Washington." A brief pause. "I think we need to talk about what happened to your service record and what we intend to do about it." She told Representative Marsh she'd call back in 20 minutes, and she meant it as a delay. But Marsh said, "I'll hold," with the flat certainty of a woman who had not gotten to a subcommittee chairmanship by accepting deferrals. So Megan kept walking down the corridor and talked while she moved. Marsh was direct in the way of people who had limited time and had stopped pretending otherwise. She'd been briefed by her subcommittee staff on the North Star situation at 5 p.m. She didn't say how her staff had obtained the information, and Megan didn't ask, because the answer was almost certainly Walt Greer, and this was not the moment for that conversation. The subcommittee had been building its case on the dissolved medic programs for 18 months. Megan's file had been flagged early as a significant instance: 9 years of field service, documented interventions, classification applied broadly rather than for any legitimate security reason. Webb's affidavit had given them Webb's first-person account. The North Star situation had given them a public event with a documented institutional response. "We've been waiting for a trigger," Marsh said. "Something that brings the classification question into public view without us having to do it unilaterally. What happened at your hospital last night, and today that's the trigger." "With respect, Representative," Megan said, "what happened at my hospital last night was a dog nearly dying because an attending physician didn't read the handler's binder." "I understand that," Marsh said. "And I'm not minimizing it. But the reason that dog didn't die is that you were there, and the reason you had to fight to stay in that room is that nobody in that building knew who you were. And the reason nobody knew who you were is a classification order that should never have been applied to your record in the first place." A pause. "That's not a coincidence. That's a policy failure with a name on it. What do you need from me right now?" "Nothing. Let the inquiry run. Let Delacroix do her work. The declassification request she filed this afternoon. I'm going to make sure it moves in 48 hours instead of 72. I have that capacity." Another pause shorter. "What I need from you eventually is a willingness to be on record. Testimony. If it comes to that." "If it comes to that," Megan said. "Yes, it will," Marsh said. And she said it without drama, just as information. "Get through tonight first. The call ended. Megan pushed through a door into the nursing station on the lower floor, found a terminal, and spent 17 minutes producing the cleanest written account she'd composed since her last field report. Everything from the moment she'd entered the records office to the moment Hale had left, timestamps drawn from her phone's call log and text history, and the corridor clock he'd clocked automatically because old habits were structural. She sent it to Delacroix's contact number and then printed a copy and brought it to Sandra because she'd learned early that the safest documentation was documentation in multiple hands. The emergency board session at 8:30 was closed to non-board personnel, which meant Megan waited in the family lounge again. And this time she had company. Overton was there, still running on no sleep, and the mechanical commitment of a man who had decided he wasn't leaving the building until he knew the full outcome. Dr. Reyes had come down from the resident locker room, still in his scrubs, with the specific look of a young physician who had spent the day doing something that felt right and was only now fully processing what it was going to cost him professionally. Ross was there too. She'd been in and out of the building all day, coordinating between Thorne's team and the Mountain Home Base commander's office, and she had the efficient tiredness of someone who ran on structure rather than sleep. Nobody talked much. There was a television in the corner of the lounge tuned to the local news. Someone had turned the volume low, but the footage was already running again. The 47 seconds of records office video that the anonymous tip line had received, timestamps, visible in the corner, Hale's hand taking the folder across the counter. Buffalo watched it once and then looked away. "Who posted it?" he said quietly. "Akins." Nobody answered. Megan had a theory. The records clerk, frightened and trying to do the right thing after the encounter, or someone on the administrative staff who'd understood what they were seeing. It didn't matter particularly who. It mattered that it was out. Overton was watching the television in the military, he said. "We had a word for what he did in that bay. My commander steps out of a situation because it's getting bad, and he doesn't want to be the one holding it." He paused. "We had several words, actually, none of them printable. He called security before he came back in," Paolo said. It wasn't a question. He'd read the timeline. "Yes," Megan said. Paolo was quiet for a moment. "I watched the pressure drop," he said. "I was tracking it. 64 systolic, that's shock territory. I held the protocol because he said hold it." He rubbed the back of his neck. I kept thinking there must be something he's seeing that I'm not. Because he's been doing this for 23 years, and I've been doing it for 2. That's how it works," Megan said, "until it doesn't. I get better. The knowing when to override, not about that honestly. Not exactly better. You get more data points. You get a longer history of what happens when you hold the protocol because someone senior said so versus what happens when you don't." She paused. "It stays hard." He nodded. He looked like he'd wanted a cleaner answer and was deciding whether to accept that one instead. The board session ran until 10:45. When Thorne and Delacroix came out, they came out with Miriam Stokes. And that told Megan something before anyone spoke. The board chair walking out with the military team rather than with her own administrative staff was an alignment that had a specific meaning. Stokes was a tall woman in her 60s, silver-haired with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the look of someone who had been absorbing information for 2 hours and had finished deciding what to do with it. She looked at Megan directly. "An apology on behalf of this institution," she said. Megan waited. "I've reviewed the footage. I've reviewed the monitoring logs. I've reviewed Dr. Hale's incident report alongside the sequence of events documented by the military team, and I've reviewed the written account you filed with JG Officer Delacroix regarding the records office." Stokes's was even and careful, the voice of a woman making a statement she was aware would have formal consequences. "The administrative leave filed against you was predicated on a complaint that was itself filed in bad faith. Your actions in that trauma bay were not insubordinate. They were correct and they were documented, and the outcome is not in dispute." She paused. "The leave is rescinded. Effective this moment, you're restored to full standing." "Thank you," Megan said. "Don't thank me. I should have seen the shape of Hale's management pattern before it produced this." Stokes glanced at Thorne. "The board has voted to cooperate fully with the military inquiry and to conduct a parallel internal investigation into Dr. Hale's conduct, including the records office incident, the timing of the security call, and what the monitoring logs indicate about his actions during the period of Ranger's decompensation." "Criminal referral?" Delacroix asked. "The unauthorized access to Dr. Ferris's credentials is being referred to the hospital's legal counsel for assessment. It's a separate track." Stokes removed her reading glasses from her forehead and held them. We're also reviewing the complaint filed with the medical board this evening. 5. We believe and our legal team believes that it constitutes a retaliatory filing, and we're prepared to submit a formal response to that effect. 5. It was not a perfect outcome. Megan knew that Hale was not arrested, was not walked out of the building in handcuffs, was not facing immediate consequences that matched the weight of what he'd done. The process was going to take weeks, possibly months. 5. There would be more documentation, more sessions, more carefully worded institutional statements. That was how it worked. But he had been asked to stay in the building, and Stokes had just told her why. Where is he? Asked. He's in his office, Stokes said. Hospital security is posted outside. He's been informed he's not to access any patient or personnel records, and he's not to enter the trauma department pending investigation. She paused. His surgical privileges are suspended as of 30 minutes ago. 23 years of authority. Suspended at 10:47 p.m. on a Tuesday because a dog tag had shifted above a collar, and a woman who'd spent 9 years keeping her record compressed had read a presentation correctly. She went back to Ranger at 11:15. He was sleeping properly this time, the deep, legitimate sleep of an animal whose body had decided that healing was the priority. His breathing was slow, and even his vitals holding steady on the monitor, the suture site clean in the low light of the recovery room. She sat beside him and didn't need to touch him. Just being in the room felt like enough. She pulled Webb's letter from her pocket and read it again. She'd read it 3 times now, and each time something different snagged. This time it was the last line of the second page. Every behavioral indicator that meant something was wrong the way Webb had listed it alongside the medical history, as if the two were equally important, equally worth writing down. Because to Webb they were, because Webb had paid attention to both. She folded the letter and put it back. Overton appeared in the doorway. At some point she wasn't sure how much later Tide gotten elastic in the way it did when she was tired and the immediate pressure had released. He looked at Ranger for a moment, then at her board secession's done. Suspended, she said, full investigation. Overton absorbed that, he nodded. Slow Webb would have had something to say about that, he said. Something short, probably. He came and sat on the other side of the padded surface. They were quiet for a while with the dog between them and the monitor's soft, regular sound. 4 years, Overton said eventually. I took him everywhere I went after retirement. When you retire a working dog, the transition can go either way. Some of them adapt fast. Some of them spend years trying to figure out where the job went. He paused. Ranger never fully adapted. He was always on watch. Acres. Up looking for the thing that needed doing. He looked at the sleeping dog. Tonight's the first time I've seen him just sleep. Megan didn't say anything. She understood that he wasn't asking for a response. She drove home at midnight. She sat in her car in the parking structure for a few minutes. Not for any dramatic reason, but because she was tired, and the transition from the building to the outside world required a moment of adjustment. Dog tag was warm from being against her skin all day. Left it there. The next 72 hours moved in a different rhythm, not the compressed urgency of Tuesday, but the slower, more grinding work of process running its course. Representative Marsh's office came through on the declassification timeline. 48 hours, as promised, not 72. The relevant sections of Megan's service record were cleared Thursday morning, and Delacroix filed them with the inquiry's documentation package by noon. At 2 p.m., North Star's legal counsel had received the full picture. 9 years, 27 documented field interventions, 11 involving military working dogs, 5 battlefield evacuations under fire, and this was the section that produced the longest silence from the hospital's attorney, a formal military commendation from 2011 that had been buried under the same classification order as everything else. A commendation was for actions in Kandahar. It included a citation from the unit commander whose men she had evacuated. It was specific about what she'd done and in what conditions and what training it had required. The scope of practice allegation in Hale's complaint, unauthorized surgical consultation on a veterinary patient, did not survive contact with a military commendation that detailed her field qualification to assess and treat combat injured working dogs in active operational environments. The medical board's preliminary reviewer received the declassified record at 3:30 Thursday afternoon. At 5 p.m., the preliminary review was closed. The complaint had been filed anonymously. Star's legal team had retained a forensic IT consultant to trace the filing's metadata. They had a result. Friday morning, the filing had originated from a device registered to the hospital's administrative network. Specifically from a terminal in the trauma department's attending physician workroom, A terminal accessed per the access log using Victor Hale's credentials at 5:39 p.m. on Tuesday. Outed himself 18 minutes before the board session began. X called Megan directly to tell her that Friday morning at 7:40, while Megan was in the break room with the first coffee she'd managed to finish in 3 days. We're moving to terminate, Stokes said. Not suspension termination for cause. The board telling you before I tell him. Because you deserve to know first. 5. Megan held the coffee cup and looked at the wall. What cause? Gross clinical negligence in the matter of Ranger's care. Authorized access to protected medical records using falsified credentials. Retaliatory. Filing of a complaint with the medical board using falsified authorization. Stokes stopped briefly falsification of his own incident report. 5. His report stated that you had been removed from the bay prior to the animal's first crash event. A monitoring log shows the first alarm at 14:26. The security escort began at 14:29. She paused. He wrote it in the wrong order deliberately, 3 minutes. He'd transposed 3 minutes in the written record to make it appear. She'd been removed before the crisis escalated rather than during it. He's been doing this for a long time, Megan said. Not as a conclusion, more as a thing she'd been holding at the edge of her thinking since Tuesday, and was only now setting down. The internal investigation is looking at prior cases, Stokes said. If the pattern holds, this isn't the first time documentation was managed after the fact. A longer pause. I want to be transparent with you. This is going to get worse before it gets better on his end. I don't know yet how much worse, I understand. I also want to tell you, and I'm speaking as board chair, so this is formal, that what you did on Monday night was exactly what a qualified medical professional should do when they see a patient in danger. The fact that it cost you what it did is something this institution is going to have to reckon with. Stokes's voice was even not performative. We'll talk about what that reckoning looks like when the investigation concludes. I was called into Stokes's office at 9 a.m. Friday. Megan wasn't there for it. She was on the floor. Sandra had her back on regular rotation, carefully positioned away from the trauma department, which was operating under an interim attending pulled from the hospitalist pool while the investigation ran. And she was doing her job. Vital checks, documentation, a complicated IV situation in room 3 that took 35 minutes to sort out, because the previous night's nurse had noted something ambiguous, and the clarification required 2 phone calls and a read of the original order. Ordinary work, the kind that didn't have an audience. It's at 9:42. She heard, through the floor's efficient informal network, a word from the unit secretary who mentioned it within earshot of the nursing station that Hale had left Stokes's office at 9:38, with a box and a hospital security escort to his car. She was recapping a needle when she heard it. She finished capping the needle, disposed of it, and washed her hands. Apollo found her at 11. He'd been on overnight and was still in the building, running on the specific adrenaline of someone who couldn't bring themselves to leave while things were still resolving. Paolo said, I heard, how are you? He stopped. Uttered again. Is it enough, the outcome? She thought about that, honestly, the way she'd answered his earlier question. Ask me again. In 6 months, she said, right now it's just what happened. Nodded. He understood that wasn't evasion, it was accuracy. The satisfaction people expected from justice was usually delayed past the moment of the event itself, because the event was always messier and more complicated and more exhausting than the idea of it. I'm staying in the program, he said, residency. Almost there was a night earlier this week when I was very close to calling the program director and asking for a transfer. He paused. I'm not going to do that. Good, she said. You're going to be a decent attendant someday. Slightly decent, he repeated, slightly offended. I'll upgrade to good after I see a few more years of your work. He almost smiled. Close enough, the investigation's preliminary report landed the following Tuesday. It was an internal document, not public, distributed to the board and to the inquiry's military team. But Delacroix shared the relevant sections with Megan under the disclosure provisions of the active inquiry, which meant she read it sitting across from Thorne in the same small conference room they'd used on Wednesday morning. The report identified 3 prior cases over the past 4 years in which Hale's documentation had been altered or resequenced after the fact. 2 involved outcome discrepancies cases where the documented timeline of intervention didn't match the monitoring data. Involved a personnel file, a complaint from a previous nurse that had been submitted, logged, and then had its timestamp in the system altered to post-date a corresponding note from Hale that effectively neutralized it. The nurse in question had been let go 6 months after filing. Non-renewal, no stated reason. Megan read that section twice. She set the report down on the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Eyes. Who was she? Asked. Thorne checked his notes. Her name is Dara Wills. She's currently working at a clinic in Nampa. Does she know? The investigation reached out to her Wednesday. She's been interviewed. He paused. She said she'd been waiting 3 years for someone to find that. Lines. Megan looked back at the report. 3 years. Dara Wills at a clinic in Nampa, having filed a complaint that had been quietly buried, having lost her position at North Star without an explanation she could prove, carrying that for 3 years. What happens to her case? Megan asked. That's a separate track, Delacroix said from her seat at the end of the table. Wrongful termination. Potentially, depending on what the investigation establishes. Hospital's legal exposure on that is considerable. Eyes. She should know that, Megan said. She should know the full shape of it. She will. LaCroix said her attorney's been contacted. Eyes. Megan sat with that for a moment. Dara Wills wasn't part of her story, exactly. But she was part of the same pattern, the same structural decision that Hale had over and over, that the people below him were manageable. That documentation was flexible. That the institution's need for a competent chief surgeon would always outweigh whatever a nurse had written in her file. He'd been right about that for years. He'd stopped being right at 4:47 p.m. on a Monday, when a military transport arrived with a dog and a handler and an emergency binder that nobody in the trauma bay had bothered to read. Was moved to a ground-floor recovery suite on Wednesday, which had better light and a view of a small courtyard. Athens. He was walking short distances, supervised with the careful deliberation of an animal rebuilding his confidence in his own legs. Appetite was improving. The vet tech who'd been assigned to his daily care had noted in the chart with professional restraint that he was highly attentive to staff movement and demonstrates good environmental orientation, which Megan read as he is running this room and everyone in it with polite authority. She visited twice a day, morning before her shift, evening after. Ranger had developed a pattern. When she came in, he would lift his head, back her to her usual spot, and then settle. He didn't perform enthusiasm. He just noted her arrival and adjusted accordingly, the way a dog did when someone's presence was expected rather than novel. Everton had gone home Thursday to his house outside Boise, where he needed to be, where a week of deferred life had accumulated. He'd shaken Megan's hand before he left and held it a beat longer than a handshake required, and she'd let him. Webb, he said. Webb always did, she said. She was in the courtyard side recovery suite on Friday afternoon. Ranger was in his post-walk rest, stretched out with his chin on his front paws, watching the light move on the courtyard when Thorne appeared in the doorway. Had a folder. She recognized the weight of it from how he held it. The full declassification came through an hour ago, he said. That's everything. Shah, Kandahar. The 3rd and 4th deployments. The field veterinary certifications. He came in and sat in the chair across from her. So there's also a formal military review of the dissolution order itself. Russia's committee filed the request this morning. If the review finds, as it's expected to, that the classification was improperly applied, the record correction is retroactive. Retroactive. Meaning what exactly? Meaning your service grade at separation would be reviewed. Meaning the commendations that were filed and then buried under classification would be formally entered into your public record. He paused. Meaning the Army would in effect have to account for what it did. Megan looked at Ranger. He was watching Thorne with the careful attention of a dog who had learned to read people and was currently gathering data. And the medical board complaint. Closed, Thorne said. Dismissed as retaliatory and without basis. The board's decision was filed this morning. He opened the folder and removed a single sheet, slid it across to her. This is the dismissal notice. You should have it. She picked it up and read it. It was brief and formal, and it said in the careful language of institutional decisions that the complaint had been reviewed and found to be without merit, and that no action would be taken against the licensure of Megan Carter RN. She put it back in the folder. There's something else, Thorne said. He was looking at her with the particular attention of a man delivering something he'd been thinking about how to deliver. Affidavit, the full version. Now that declassification is complete, it includes a recommendation. Formal military language, filed as part of the affidavit's 3rd section. Kind of recommendation. For the creation of a veterinary trauma protocol, military working dog emergency care, standardized for civilian medical facilities that receive military transfers. He paused. He specified it should be developed by someone with field veterinary trauma experience and current civilian nursing credentials. Another pause. Ranger exhaled through his nose. It was a soft sound, the sound of a dog settling deeper into rest. Out of everything, she said. He had a year to think, Thorne said. Nice. He used it. She sat with that web sick, and knowing it, spending the time he had left building a paper trail that would outlast him, the affidavit, the letter, the binder for Overton. The recommendation buried in the third section, where it would only be found once the declassification came through. The particular discipline of a man who had done serious work and understood that the work needed to be protected. Of the protocol, she said. What would it take to develop it? Institutional support access to the military working dog program's medical records. Thorne closed the folder. Star would need to formally agree to host the development process. Given what happened this week, I don't think that's going to be a difficult conversation. And the subcommittee Marsh's office. They're prepared to fund it. Line item. They've been trying to justify for 2 years. Ed's recommendation. Now declassified, now public gives them the justification. He looked at her levelly. Again, you'd be building something that doesn't exist yet. A formal standard that every civilian facility near a military installation would be required to train against. She looked at Ranger. He'd opened his eyes. He was watching her with his dark, serious gaze. The same gaze she'd met across a trauma bay on Monday night, when he'd found her face in a sedated fog and stayed with it. I need to think about it, she said. Of course, Thorne said. He stood, nodded to her, and left. The door to the recovery suite was open. Hospital recovery rooms didn't close unless they needed to, and this one didn't need to. Through it she could hear the ordinary sounds of the floor, the wheels of a supply cart, a distant call button, someone's voice giving a number. She was thinking about the protocol, running the shape of it in her mind, the gaps it would fill, the way it would need to be structured to be actually usable, rather than just formally existing when her phone buzzed. Andra. Something happening in admin. You need to see this. Come up. Look at local news. She opened her browser. The headline took a moment to load, and when it did she read it twice before she understood what she was looking at. North Star Chief Surgeon faces federal inquiry, unauthorized records access linked to broader pattern of document tampering. DA's office confirms. Not a hospital investigation. Not an internal review. It's the district attorney's office, she scrolled. The article was brief, filed minutes ago, sourced to a DA spokesperson who had confirmed that an inquiry was underway based on referrals from both North Star Regional Medical Center and a federal military judicial officer. The spokesperson had confirmed that the investigation extended beyond the single incident of unauthorized records access and was examining a pattern of conduct. She kept scrolling, looking for the detail she'd felt coming since she'd read the internal reports section on Dara Wills, the detail that would tell her whether this was the shape of things or the beginning of a larger shape. She found it 3 paragraphs down. The DA's office had confirmed they were examining 3 prior cases identified by the hospital's internal investigation. They had also confirmed, and this was the part that stopped her, that a 4th case had been brought to their attention by an outside party. Not a hospital case. A case from 7 years ago, a different institution. Had been at North Star for 9 years. Before North Star, he'd been chief of trauma at a medical center in Boise's sister city, a facility that had closed 4 years ago, and whose records had been archived and transferred. Outside party, who had brought the 4th case to the DA's office, was not named. But the 4th case involved a patient outcome that had been, according to the spokesperson's careful language, inconsistent with the documentation on record. Put the phone down on the floor beside Ranger's padded surface. She'd thought she understood what Hale was. She'd read him correctly, the willingness to manage documentation, the instinct to remove obstacles rather than accommodate them. She'd been right about all of it, but she'd been reading a single chapter of something that was considerably longer. Nature lifted his head and looked at her. I know, she said. He held her gaze for a moment and then put his head back down with the measured calm of a dog who had survived serious things before and had learned that waiting was also a form of action. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she didn't know, with a 202 area code, Washington. Athens. Nurse Carter, said a man's voice, formal and unhurried. My name is Special Agent Doran with the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Unit. I believe you may be in possession of information relevant to an investigation we opened this afternoon. He paused. I was hoping you'd be willing to speak with us. She told Special Agent Doran she was available to speak and asked him how quickly he needed it. If possible, we can come to you. I'm at North Star Regional, she said. I'll be here for another 2 hours. We'll be there in 45 minutes. She put the phone down and sat with the weight of that for a moment. FBI. Healthcare fraud, a 4th case from a prior institution, an outside party who'd brought it forward. A patient outcome inconsistent with the documentation on record. She ran the implications out to their logical ends the way she'd been trained to assess field situations, not catastrophizing, not minimizing, just mapping the terrain. Hale hadn't become what he was at North Star. He'd arrived already formed. 9 years at North Star. And before that, how many years at the prior facility? How many cases, how many documentation decisions made in the confident expectation that nobody who mattered would look too closely? A hospital that had closed 4 years ago. Its records archived and transferred sitting in a database, somewhere waiting for someone to ask the right question. Someone had asked it today. She didn't know who, she wasn't certain it mattered. She spent the 45 minutes doing the thing she'd been doing all week. When the pressure had a gap in it, she sat with Ranger and she let the thinking happen without trying to direct it. He was awake and watchful, his ears tracking sounds she couldn't hear, his body carrying the particular alertness of a dog who had been trained to read environments and hadn't stopped just because his formal service had ended. His suture site was healing cleanly. His eyes were clear. When the 2 FBI agents arrived, Doran, who took notes in a small notebook, with a mechanical precision that reminded Megan of Delacroix, she met them in the family lounge and gave them everything she had in the order she had it, not performing recollection, not shaping the narrative toward any outcome, just moving through the sequence of events with the same flat accuracy she'd brought to the written account she'd filed with Delacroix. What she'd seen, what she'd said, what the timestamps showed, what the monitoring logs showed, what the records office had looked like, and what Hale had said while he was in it. Doran listened with the quality of attention that experienced investigators had complete unhurried, not filling the silences. He asked 3 clarifying questions across 40 minutes, and all 3 were specific and precise, aimed at details of sequence rather than interpretation. When she finished, he closed his own notebook. The 4th case, he said. We're not going to discuss the specifics with you tonight. But I want you to understand the scope of what we're looking at. He paused. What happened here this week gave us access to documentation that had been inaccessible for jurisdictional reasons. The hospital that closed its records were transferred to a state archive. We've had reason to look at a case from that archive for 14 months. We didn't have enough to open a federal file. He looked at her steadily. A pattern. Your hospital's investigation identified the documentation resequencing, the file manipulation. It matches the pattern in the archived case. That's enough. Enough to open the file, she said. To open it and move, he stood. You may be contacted again as the investigation progresses. I'd ask you not to discuss the specifics of our conversation tonight. Understood, she said. Salcedo closed her notebook. They shook hands and left, and Megan sat in the empty lounge for a few minutes after, listening to the hospital's overnight sounds settling around her. She thought about the patient in the 4th case. She didn't know who they were, didn't know their name, their age, what they'd come in for, what had happened to them. She probably would never know that was not her information. But they were somewhere in all of this, in the paper trail, and the archived records, and the 14 months that In's team had spent trying to find a way, and somewhere in there was a person or a person's family who had been carrying something for years without a name to put on it. Now they'd get a name. The weeks that followed had the texture of institutional process, which was slow and unglamorous and almost nothing like the way people imagined justice looked when they were outside it. There were no dramatic courtroom moments, no single pivot where everything resolved at once. There was documentation and review and response and counter-response, and the gradual accumulation of a record that was becoming too heavy to argue against. Victor Hale was formally terminated from North Star Regional Medical Center on the 2nd Friday after the board's emergency session. The termination cited gross clinical negligence, falsification of medical records, unauthorized access to protected personnel files, and retaliatory conduct. It was sent by certified mail and delivered to an address in the north end of Boise where Hale had lived for 11 years. Idaho medical license was suspended by the state licensing board, pending investigation 6 days after that. The suspension was not permanent, not yet, but it was public, which meant it appeared in the state's online physician database alongside his name, visible to anyone who searched. The Idaho Medical Board's response to the retaliatory complaint against Megan was formal and complete. The complaint was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be repealed in its current form. The board issued a brief public notice of the dismissal standard procedure, and Delacroix made sure it was entered into the military inquiry's record. Wills, the nurse who had filed a complaint 3 years ago and lost her position at North Star, 6 months later retained an attorney in the week after the investigation went public. The hospital's legal counsel opened settlement discussions within 10 days. Science. Megan didn't know the terms, wasn't supposed to, but Sandra told her that the discussions were moving and that Dara Wills would be made whole in the ways an institution could manage, which wasn't everything, but was not nothing. The Congressional Subcommittee's review of the dissolution order that had buried Megan's record was formally opened in the third week of November. Representative Marsh's office issued a brief statement describing the scope of the review: 3 dissolved programs. A total of 41 personnel whose records had been classified under the broad administrative order, and noting that the review was expected to conclude within 4 months. Megan read the statement on her phone during a lunch break, and then put her phone away and finished eating. 51 people she'd known. She wasn't the only one. She hadn't known the number. Thorne came back to Boise in the third week of November, this time without Delacroix, just himself and the quiet efficiency of a man tying off the parts of a task that had been left open. He met Megan for coffee at a place near the hospital, a small diner that she'd been going to for 2 years and that had nothing to recommend it beyond proximity and reliable coffee. And they sat across from each other in a booth and talked about the protocol. She'd been thinking about it since he'd first mentioned it. She'd been thinking about it the way she thought about problems she was going to solve. Not if, but how. What was the structure? What were the gaps? What did the thing need to be in order to actually function in the conditions where it would be used? I want it to be practical, she said. Not a document that satisfies a training requirement and sits in a binder. Something that works at 3 in the morning when the transport arrives, and the team has never dealt with a military working dog before. That's what Webb intended, Thorne said. It needs field language, she continued. Not clinical language, not veterinary language. Something that a floor nurse with no military background can pick up in 30 seconds in use. She had a legal pad on the table that she'd been writing on during the walk over, and she turned it to face him. Outline. 5 sections with notes in the margins. Indicators. Behavioral reads the specific presentations that look like one thing in a civilian animal and mean something different in a working dog. Escalation triggers. When to call, who to call, what information to have ready. Then looked at the legal pad. He looked at it for a long time. You've already started, he said. I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks. You've already started, he said again, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite humor, but was adjacent. Had to, she said. He picked up his coffee cup. The subcommittee's funding allocation comes through in January. Josh's office confirmed it yesterday. The program wants to host the development process out of the Mountain Home facility with North Star as the civilian partner institution. Have access to the MWD medical archives, the full program records going back 15 years. 15 years, she said. That was a meaningful number. 15 years of working dog cases. Pattern. She could map presentations. She could build the triage section from. You'd keep your nursing position at North Star, he said. The protocol development would be structured as a parallel assignment. Time initially, potentially full-time if the scope expands. He paused. It would expand. She looked at the legal pad, at the 5 sections and the marginal notes, and the shape of something that didn't exist yet, but was Marsh. Yes, she said. Ranger was cleared for discharge from North Star's veterinary recovery on a Tuesday morning in the first week of December, 6 days, after he'd arrived on a military transport with a failing spleen and a handler who'd spent the night in the waiting room refusing to sit. The discharge process was medically straightforward. His seizures had been removed 2 weeks earlier. His vitals were stable. His mobility had improved significantly over the preceding weeks. He was walking normally, managing stairs, carrying himself with the particular bearing of a dog who had decided that recovery was complete and it was time to get on with things. Dr. Rouse had signed off on the discharge that morning with a note in the chart that he was, in Rouse's words, a remarkably resilient patient with good compliance and strong owner engagement. The owner question had been resolved in the second week. Instructions had been formal and specific, and once the relevant military documentation was in order, the transfer was uncomplicated. The paperwork made it official, but the reality of it had been established in the first hours in the recovery room, in the way Ranger's nose had pressed against her hand and stayed there. He was hers. He'd been waiting to be it and drove in from outside the city for the discharge. He arrived at 8 in the morning with a leash, not the military-issue transport lead, but a good civilian leash, well-made, which he'd clearly bought for this specific purpose, and he brought it to Megan rather than bringing it to the recovery suite himself. She took it without a word. He stood in the doorway of the recovery suite while she went in. Ranger was up, wait, even on all 4 legs, ears forward, tracking her entry with the focused attention that she'd come to recognize as his baseline mode of being present in the world. He'd gotten used to the recovery room in the way animals got used to spaces not comfortably, but tolerantly, with the patient acceptance of an animal who understood that this was a temporary condition. She clipped the leash to his collar. He looked at it. He looked at her. Ready, she said. He leaned into the leash, pulling gently toward the door. Let him lead. They walked out of the recovery suite and down the corridor, and the thing she hadn't anticipated was how the floor responded. She'd expected it to be quiet. Hospital discharges usually were a paperwork transaction followed by a departure. But they passed the nursing station, and Sandra Okafor was there, and the tech who'd been in the bay on Monday night, and Paulo Reyes, who had come in early for no reason that had anything to do with his shift schedule. And they were simply present, not making a production of it, just standing in the corridor as she and Ranger moved through it. And the quality of their presence was the same quality she'd felt in the field, when a team gathered around something that mattered without anyone having to say why. She got to the main entrance and stopped. Thorne was there. She hadn't known he was still in the city, but he was standing near the doors with Voss, both of them in civilian clothes. And when Ranger saw Voss, the dog's whole bearing shifted in the specific way it did when he recognized a familiar scent from a context where he'd been safer than he'd remembered. Voss crouched down. Ranger pressed his nose against her hand, then moved on, pulled back toward Megan with the quiet decisiveness of a dog who knew which direction he was going. Watched. That happened. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Overton held the door, and Megan walked Ranger out of North Star Regional Medical Center into the cold December air. The federal investigation into Victor Hale moved on its own timeline, which was slower than any of the institutional processes and more thorough. FBI's healthcare fraud unit was not in the business of quick resolutions. They built cases that held, which meant the months between the investigation's opening and any formal action were months of document review and witness interviews, and the careful construction of a record that a federal prosecutor could take into a courtroom with confidence. Megan was interviewed 3 more times over the following months. Each interview was specific and focused, asking about different pieces of what she'd seen and what she'd documented, and each time she answered with the same flat accuracy she'd brought to the first conversation with Doran. She was told in the 4th month that a second patient case from Hale's tenure at the prior institution had been identified. She was told in the 5th month that the investigation had expanded to include the hospital's credentialing process, specifically whether Hale's references had been adequately checked when North Star hired him, and whether certain elements of his prior history had been available and not examined. She was not told the details of those elements. She understood from the shape of the conversation that they were significant. In the 6th month, Victor Hale was indicted on 5 federal counts, 2 counts of healthcare fraud, 1 count of obstruction of a federal investigation, 1 count of falsification of medical records with intent to deceive, 1 count related to the 4th case, whose specifics became public record with the indictment filing. The patient in that case had been a 48-year-old man named Gerald Hooper, who had died following a post-surgical complication at Hale's prior institution 7 years ago. The investigation had established that the documentation of his care had been altered after the fact to conceal a delayed intervention, that Hale had ordered a delay that the forensic medical analysis determined had been causally related to Hooper's death. The indictment was covered by the Idaho Statesman by regional affiliates, and because of the military inquiry component, and the subcommittee connection by 2 national news outlets that ran the story on a slow news Tuesday in the 5th month of the following year. Men read the coverage at her kitchen table with coffee she actually drank. She read the name Gerald Hooper and sat with it, a man she'd never met who had died in an institution she'd never worked at, whose family had spent 7 years without an answer that matched what they'd experienced. She didn't know if the indictment was the answer they'd been waiting for. She suspected it was complicated, that it was both more and less than what a family needed when they'd lost someone, that it was the available institutional response to something the institution was structurally incapable of fully addressing. But it was real, it was on the record. And the record, as she had learned over the course of a year that had rearranged the shape of her life, was the thing that outlasted everything else. The first version of the military working dog emergency protocol was completed in March, 6 months after Thorne had told her about Webb's recommendation. It was 43 pages, which was longer than she'd originally planned, but shorter than the early draft had been. She'd cut significantly sections against Paulo and against 2 nurses from the Mountain Home Base Medical Unit, who'd volunteered to run through the triage indicators blind and rewritten anything that produced hesitation. Hesitation test was the standard she'd set for it. If a nurse unfamiliar with working dogs read a section as to interpret it, the section needed to be rewritten. Practical meant usable at speed by someone who hadn't trained for this specifically. It took 3 drafts and 4 months of iteration to get every section past that bar. The protocol's introduction was 2 paragraphs. She'd written it last, and it said what she wanted to say without ornamentation. Dietary. Working dogs are not standard patients. They are trained to suppress behavioral indicators of pain and distress, which means clinical presentations that would be obvious in a civilian animal may be absent, delayed, or actively masked. This protocol exists to close the gap between what a working dog shows and what a working dog is experiencing. Use the physical indicators, not the behavioral ones. The numbers act on the timeline, not the presentation. She printed a copy of the completed protocol and put it on Webb's section of the documentation file she'd built over the preceding months, a folder that contained his letter, his affidavit, the section of the declassified record that cited her Kandahar service, and a photograph she'd found in the military archive. And Ranger, outside a forward operating base, Ranger at the sit beside him, with his ears up and his gaze on whatever was at the edge of the frame. Webb was looking at the camera. Exactly. Webb rarely smiled in photographs, but there was something in his expression that she recognized as a man who was exactly where he'd chosen to be. She'd had the photograph printed and framed. It was on the bookshelf in her apartment, which had begun to look incrementally like a place where someone had decided to stay. The subcommittee review concluded in the 4th month. Of the 41 personnel whose records had been classified under the dissolution order, 37 were determined to have had the classification improperly applied. The review's findings were published as a formal congressional report that ran to 112 pages and included in an appendix a summary of each affected service member's record with the corrected documentation. Megan's entry in the appendix was 3 paragraphs. It cited her service dates, her deployments, her field interventions, her qualification certifications, and the commendation from Kandahar. It concluded with a single sentence noting that the classification of her record had resulted in professional limitations that were inconsistent with her documented capabilities, and that the record was hereby corrected in full. 3 paragraphs. 9 years, 2 deployments, 5 combat rotations, 27 interventions, 11 dogs, and a woman who had spent 12 years building a smaller life in a space that didn't know what to do with what she'd actually done. She read her 3 paragraphs once. Then she read the 36 entries before and after hers, because those were also people and the report was also about them. And the thing about institutional failures of this kind was that they were only visible as individual stories at the edges. But the damage ran all the way through. Bush's office called to inform her that 4 of the 37 affected personnel had indicated they would pursue formal compensation claims through the military review process. She was asked if she wished to be included. She said she'd consider it and let them know, which she was six months later, because the financial question was complicated by the reality that what she'd built in the aftermath was worth more to her than what the institution owed her in backdated recognition. And that was a calculation she was still running. Hospital's apology was formal and public, which was what Stokes had promised when she'd said the institution had to reckon with what it had allowed. It came in the form of a board statement released in February, which acknowledged that Megan's administrative leave had been filed in bad faith. The escalation of Hale's conduct had been facilitated by institutional failure to maintain appropriate oversight, and that her actions in the trauma bay had been both professionally appropriate and directly responsible for preserving Ranger's life. The statement was posted to the hospital's website and shared with local media. Because institutional apologies, they were written by committees and reviewed by attorneys, and they had the specific quality of language that had been revised until it was accurate, but no longer felt like it had been written by a human being. She read it and understood what it was worth, which was not nothing, and also understood what it wasn't, which was the thing you actually wanted, which was to have not needed it. She'd stopped waiting for what she actually wanted a long time ago, and had gotten reasonably good at taking what was available and building from there. The memorial was in May at the Mountain Home Air Force Base. It was a formal ceremony for Marcus Webb held later than such ceremonies, usually were because of the investigation and the declassification process and the reality that when a man's death triggers a congressional review, the institutional response takes time to catch up to the personal one. She drove out with Ranger in the back seat. He had a proper harness now anchored to the seat's mounting point, because working dogs in vehicles were safer restrained, and he tolerated it with the resigned practicality of an animal who had decided that certain constraints were worth accepting for the sake of the larger arrangement. He watched the landscape through the window for most of the drive. A desert, flat light, the kind of January remnant cold that the spring hadn't fully burned off. He tracked a hawk once, his head turning to follow it until it was out of sight, and then he returned to whatever internal state he'd been in before. The ceremony was on a parade ground beside the main administrative building. 60 people, a mix of uniformed personnel and civilians' family, former colleagues, the kind of gathering that formed around a military life when it ended. Overton. Voss was there. 2 men. She didn't recognize who had Webb's quality of stillness, which meant they'd probably served with him at some point. Webb's sister. A woman named Caroline, who looked enough like him that Megan knew her across the parade ground before anyone introduced them. She brought Ranger to the front of the gathered group when the formal portion concluded, because that was why she'd come, not for the ceremony, which was for the people who needed the structure of it, but for the moment after. The structure fell away, and what was left was just the thing itself. She stopped in front of the memorial marker, a simple granite plaque, name and dates and service record, and looked at it for a moment. He was very still. She didn't know exactly what dogs understood about death and absence, and the ceremonies humans built around them, but she knew what he understood about this place, because his whole body had changed when they'd arrived, recognition that ran deeper than scent or sight. He knew this was somewhere that mattered. He knew it the way he'd known her dog tag. She crouched beside him and put her hand on his silver head. "You made it home," she said quietly. He turned and pressed his nose against her cheek, just once, and then sat back and looked at the plaque with the serious attentiveness of a dog who had decided that bearing witness was its own form of purpose. Caroline came and stood beside them after a few minutes. She'd been told about Megan, had apparently been briefed by Thorne's office in a way that gave her the shape of what had happened, and she stood with the quiet of someone who had processed most of her grief in private and was now in the public portion of it, which required a different kind of composure. "Talked about you," she said. "Not often. But when he did, he said you were the kind of person the military built, and then didn't know what to do with." She paused. "He meant it as a compliment," Megan said. "Left you his dog. He left me his dog." Caroline looked at Ranger. Ranger looked back at her with his careful measuring gaze. "Marcus, it's always said that dogs pick the right people, and humans just thought they were the ones doing the choosing." She almost smiled. "I don't know if that's true, I don't either," Megan said. "But I think Ranger had a vote." Caroline did smile, then briefly and real. The smile of someone who was both sad and intact, which was the only way to be at these things. Trial began in September, 10 months after the night Ranger had arrived at North Star. The federal process was not fast, but it was thorough, and by the time the trial opened, the prosecution had a case built from 17 months of investigation that covered 5 charges, 2 institutions, 2 patients, and a pattern of documentation manipulation that the forensic analysts had reconstructed with the methodical precision of people who did this for a living. Megan was not called as a primary trial witness. Her account was in the record, her documentation was in the record, and the prosecution's case rested primarily on the forensic evidence and on the testimony of people who had been directly affected by the 4th case. She was present for one day, the day the monitoring logs and security footage from North Star were entered into evidence. And she sat in the gallery and watched the footage play on the courtroom's display screen and felt nothing she hadn't already processed. The jury deliberated for 2.5 days. Victor Hale was convicted on 4 of the 5 counts. The 5th, the obstruction charge, resulted in a hung jury on the specific sub-element that the prosecution had pursued, but the judge had made clear in sentencing that the 4 convictions carried sufficient weight. The sentence was announced in a courtroom in downtown Boise on a Thursday afternoon in November, almost exactly a year after Ranger had been wheeled into North Star's trauma bay. 18 years, with the possibility of parole after 9. His medical license was permanently revoked by the state licensing board the following week. She heard the sentence from Thorne, who called her while she was at the Mountain Home facility, working through the 5th section of the protocol's 2nd phase expansion, which covered multi-injury presentations and had been giving her trouble for 3 weeks because the variables were harder to reduce to clean triage language. 14 years, Thorne said. She held the phone and looked at the document on the screen. License. Gone, he said. Permanent, she nodded, which he couldn't see. Okay, she said. Okay, he agreed. There was a pause that wasn't uncomfortable. Eb would have had something to say about that too, she said. Something short, Thorne said. Something short, she agreed. She was not the person she'd been a year ago. She recognized this not in any dramatic way, but in the accumulation of small differences, the way she answered when people at North Star asked what she'd done before nursing, which was now as a combat medic for 9 years rather than the compressed and evasive non-answer she'd used for over a decade. The way her apartment looked, which was more inhabited now, more books, a corkboard that had a grocery list and also a snap with pins in it, each pin marking one of the 41 records that had been corrected in the Congressional Review. She'd put the map up in February and hadn't asked herself why. It felt like the right thing to track. The protocol had been adopted by 4 civilian medical facilities near military installations in Idaho and Montana by the time the trial concluded. Josh's office was working on a broader federal directive that would require adoption by all facilities receiving military working dog transports. The process was slow. Federal directives always were, but it was moving, and the protocol document existed, and it was 43 pages of work that would outlast her career and possibly her lifetime if the adoption held. Eb's photograph was still on the shelf. She looked at it sometimes in the morning when the light was right. Not with grief, exactly. Or not only with grief. With the particular feeling of someone who understood that a person's effect on the world is not always visible to them while they're in it. And sometimes the clearest view of what someone built only becomes available after they're no longer there to see it. He'd built her a way back she hadn't known she needed one until she was already through it. On a Saturday morning in late November, 1 year and 12 days after Ranger had arrived at North Star, Megan drove to a park outside the city that she'd been going to since the previous spring. Had a long trail and a field at the center, and enough open space that a dog, who had once worked in operational environments, didn't feel compressed by the ordinary dimensions of a civilian life. Ranger ran ahead of her on the trail, not flat out. His hips were still what they were, and the surgically altered landscape of his abdomen meant he wouldn't be running flat out again. Not ever. But he moved with purpose, with the specific energy of a dog who was going somewhere, rather than simply being exercised. His nose worked constantly, cataloging a world that was available to him at a granularity no human could access. He checked back on her every 30 or 40 yards, a look over his shoulder, a brief assessment of her location and status, and then continued. She'd been thinking about Dara Wills. She'd learned 2 weeks ago through Sandra that Wills had accepted a settlement and had been offered a reinstatement at North Star, which she had declined because she'd built something at the Nampa clinic in 3 years and didn't want to leave it. She'd taken the settlement and stayed in Nampa, and that was the right decision for her. And Megan understood it as an act of self-possession rather than defeat. The thing about institutions was that they extracted the shape of you if you let them. They rewarded the version of you that fit their requirements and ignored or suppressed the version that didn't. And it was easy, almost inevitable, to start believing that the suppressed version was less real, less valid, less worth defending. She'd done it herself. 12 years of compressing. 12 years of answering questions about her background with the minimum sufficient detail. Perform a smaller version of her competence so that nobody in a trauma bay or a conference room would have to decide what to do with the larger version. It had felt like strategy, it had felt like wisdom. She'd learned what Ranger had, in his particular way, given back to her, was that the compressed version wasn't protected by its compression. It was just smaller, and smaller didn't mean safer. It meant that when the moment came where the full version was the only one that worked, you had to fight to bring it back into the room. The fight, it turned out, was worth it. The fight was always going to be worth it. She just hadn't had enough data points before. Ranger reached the field and stopped at its edge, looking back at her. His ears were forward, his body aligned toward the open space, the body language of a dog who knew what he wanted and had learned that she'd follow him into it. She unclipped the leash. He moved into the field at a steady, confident trot, nose down, tracing patterns that only made sense to him. She walked behind him at her own pace, hands in her jacket pockets, breath fogging in the cold air. She thought about the 43-page protocol. She thought about the 36 other people in the congressional scattered across the country, their compressed or uncompressed versions of the lives they'd built after the institution had filed their records as a way where nobody would find them. She thought about what it might mean to locate some of them, not as a project, not as an obligation, but as the kind of thing one person did for another when they'd come through the same terrain and wanted to signal, this way the ground is solid here. She didn't know yet if that was a thing she'd do. It was still in the category of thoughts that hadn't become decisions. Ranger looped back toward her and then past her, making a wide circle through the field's dry grass, and she watched him move in the flat November light with the feeling she'd been trying to name since May, since the memorial live, since the moment she'd unclipped him from North Star's lead and walked him out through the main doors into the cold. It was something between relief and recognition, the feeling of a thing returned that you'd given up expecting. Not joy exactly, which was too clean for what it actually was. Like the way a weight settles, when you set it down on solid ground, not gone, not forgotten, but finally in a place where it could stay. A nurse. Everyone had dismissed, had stopped waiting for permission to take up the space she'd always been capable of filling. The dog everyone had overlooked had stopped waiting for someone to remember what he was worth. They had found each other across 12 years of distance, and the ordinary disasters of 2 lives lived in difficult conditions. And they were both in their different ways, exactly where they were supposed to be. Ranger came back and pressed against her leg and looked out at the field. She put her hand on his silver head, and they stood together in the cold November air, and it was enough, and it was real, and it was theirs.